13 mansions where you won't survive. Welcome to the most useless guide you will ever hold in your hands. Useless because knowledge of these places will not help you survive if you dare to step over their threshold. Before you are 13 mansions scattered across various corners of the planet, each with its own method of dealing with uninvited guests. Some do this slowly and methodically, eroding the minds of their inhabitants over the years. Others prefer to act swiftly. They are all architectural masterpieces, gems of history, and, without the slightest exaggeration, the most dangerous houses on Earth. The author of these lines recommends reading this series in good lighting, preferably not alone, and definitely not in an old house with long corridors. If you enjoy this material, please give it a thumbs up and leave a comment. It's important for the author to know that at least one reader made it through alive. First story. The Winchester Mansion. A house built out of fear. San Jose, California, United States of America. The Winchester Mansion has stood here for over 130 years, and during that time, not one architect in their right mind would have agreed to sign off on its plans. In fact, no plan ever existed, and that is the first of many traps within this house. From the outside, it presents itself as a vast Victorian estate, akin to the ones wealthy Americans built in the late 19th century. Numerous turrets, pointed spires, wide verandas with carved railings, windows of various shapes and sizes overlooking a manicured garden with magnolias and California oaks. In autumn, when the morning sun gilds the wooden facades and makes the stained glass scatter colorful spots across the lawn, the mansion looks exactly as an ideal American home is depicted in Mark Twain's novels: majestic, warm, a little old-fashioned, and yet utterly cozy. This optical illusion is the first and most insidious trick of the Winchester house. As soon as you step inside, the architectural logic of the world begins to falter, much like in the game Layers of Fear, where corridors change behind you. Staircases leading directly to the ceiling. Doors swinging open to solid brick walls, or to the void of a 3-meter drop with no steps. Hallways bending at impossible angles and leading you back to where you just came from. Windows embedded in floors. Rooms within rooms, like Russian nesting dolls, except instead of a painted wooden toy, you find yourself in a dark, enclosed space with a single door you'll have to search for by feel. The mansion contains 160 rooms, 47 fireplaces, 10,000 windows, 2,000 doors, and 3 elevators. At least, that was the last official inventory, although some researchers are convinced that the exact number of rooms remains unknown, as some have been sealed up so long and so thoroughly that only discrepancies in the floor plans indicate their existence. To understand why everything is the way it is, one must know the story of Sarah Winchester, a woman whom some regarded as a genius of architectural madness, others as a victim of unbearable grief, and yet others, mostly her neighbors, as simply a very strange widow with an unlimited budget and an unhealthy relationship with sleep. Sarah Lockwood Pardee was born in 1842 in New Haven, Connecticut, into a family of a wealthy blacksmith. She received a fine education, a rarity for a woman of that era, and in 1862 she married William Wirt Winchester, the only heir of Oliver Fisher Winchester, the founder of the famous firearm company Winchester Repeating Arms. By that time, the Winchester Company had already made its mark in American history. Their rifles from 1873 would earn the nickname, "the gun that conquered the West." Ironically, the rifle that brought down so many people on the prairies and mountains of the American frontier ultimately returned to the family of its creator in a very different way. In 1866, Sarah gave birth to a daughter, Annie, who died just 5 weeks later from marasmus, a severe nutritional deficiency that the medicine of that time was powerless to treat. Sarah never recovered from this loss. Then, in 1881, William also passed away, slowly and painfully from tuberculosis. Sarah inherited nearly $20 million in cash and about 50% of the shares of the firearm company, which provided her with a daily income of $1,000 at the end of the 19th century, when a dollar could buy a decent meal at a nice restaurant. By today's standards, this amounts to a fortune in the hundreds of millions. Wealth did not bring her peace. According to family legend, and this is where the story takes on the flavor often cherished by authors of mystical tales, grief-stricken Sarah turned to a medium in Boston. The medium allegedly told her that the Winchester family was cursed by the spirits of all those who had been killed by their weapons: Native Americans who died in conflicts with the United States Army, soldiers from the Civil War, bandits, and civilians, hundreds and thousands of souls united by one thing: a bullet hole made in the factories of New Haven. According to the medium, the only way to appease the spirits and preserve Sarah's own life was through continuous construction. As long as building was underway, the spirits would not find peace and would not reach their mistress. Sarah bought an unfinished 8-room farmhouse in San Jose in 1884 and immediately hired workers. From that moment on, construction never ceased for even a single day. Literally not for one day, for the next 38 years. Carpenters worked in 3 shifts, around the clock, 7 days a week. Sarah personally developed the plans for the rooms, often just that very night, sketching designs on scraps of paper at such speed and volume that workers sometimes struggled to figure out where one room ended and another began. The builders added floors above already completed roofs, integrated new corridors into existing walls, bricked up entrances, and carved out new ones. At one point, the house reached 7 stories, until the earthquake of 1906 collapsed the top 3. Amid all this chaotic geometry, Sarah exhibited a strange, almost obsessive affinity for the number 13. It appeared throughout the house with admirable consistency. 13 bathrooms, 13 hooks in the closets, 13 windows in some halls, 13 steps in certain staircases, 13 panels in most ceilings. Even some of the sinks had 13 drainage holes. This fondness for the unlucky number is explained in various ways. Some researchers believe Sarah was trying to ward off spirits. In numerology, which she seemingly studied, 13 has a protective significance. Others see it as a sign of a growing mental disorder, and some simply think it was an eccentric whim of a wealthy woman. At night, Sarah supposedly slept in different bedrooms, moving from room to room along a path known only to her so that the spirits could not find her while she slept. The house boasted 39 bedrooms, a decent supply for a woman waging war against the supernatural. She locked one of the rooms, the so-called seance room or blue room, and supposedly visited it every night to receive new instructions from the spirits regarding construction. No living soul knew what occurred behind that door, as Sarah excluded the staff from entering. After her death, the room was opened, revealing only a small table, 3 chairs, and several notebooks with plans for future rooms. All else had decayed or been removed during her lifetime. Sarah Winchester died in September 1922, in her chair, in her sleep, like the righteous and those who left the spirits no escape routes. Construction immediately ceased. Workers, upon hearing of their mistress's death, dropped their tools right in the walls, where they remain. Still, in some unfinished rooms you can find nails half driven into boards, pieces of lumber, and bags of dried cement, as if the people had stepped out for lunch and never returned. Now, let's talk about rational explanations for what happens to people in this house, because a great deal of interesting occurrences take place here. The Winchester Mansion is officially recognized as one of the most well-documented locations of paranormal activity in North America, and it has been studied by researchers of all kinds, from parapsychologists to neurobiologists. Most visitors report similar experiences: an increasing sense of anxiety in the long corridors, a feeling of an unseen presence in empty rooms, disorientation, and a loss of the sense of time, as well as, in some cases, distinct auditory hallucinations in the form of footsteps, creaking hinges, or distant knocking. The infrasound theory works better in this case than in most other cursed places. The architectural chaos of Winchester creates conditions for repeated reflection of sound waves. Numerous dead-end corridors and small enclosed rooms function like resonators, while the constant wind blowing through all those countless windows and cracks generates low-frequency vibrations in the range of 18 to 20 hertz, precisely the range that the human ear cannot hear, yet the human nervous system can sense perfectly well. The result of exposure to infrasound at this frequency is a persistent feeling of anxiety, panic, and the presence of an unseen being. and with prolonged exposure, visual and auditory hallucinations can occur. Professor Vic Tandy from Coventry University in 1998 published a famous study linking infrasound to paranormal experiences. And the Winchester Mansion, with its intricate acoustic geometry, would make an ideal testing ground for his research. Add toxic mold to infrasound, which is inevitable in old wooden structures of this scale, and you have a cocktail capable of turning a tour of a beautiful historic home into a psychotic episode. The black mold Stachybotrys chartarum, which thrives on damp wooden walls, produces mycotoxins that can lead to neurological disorders with prolonged inhalation, memory lapses, coordination issues, depression, and in severe cases, vivid hallucinations. Sarah Winchester, who spent 38 years in her home under continuous construction surrounded by fresh wood, cement, and enclosed spaces, may have been the first and most long-term victim of her own architectural design. As for more recent events, in 1924, just 2 years after Sarah's death, the house was opened to the public, and since then, millions of tourists have passed through it. Most experience only mild fear and disorientation, which is understandable in a house with 760 doors and 160 rooms. However, there have been more serious cases documented. In October 1975, a group of parapsychologists, led by researcher John Mackenzie, spent a night in the house with official permission from the administration. 3 out of the 8 participants had to be evacuated before dawn. One complained of acute panic attacks that did not respond to medication. Another was found sitting in one of the dead-end corridors in a state characterized by his colleagues as acute dissociation. And the third participant, a young researcher named Diana Fletcher, refused to leave the so-called daguerreotype room on the second floor, insisting that she could hear a voice calling her name from behind the wall. All 3 later insisted that their experiences could not be explained solely by architectural anomalies. In 2009, a film crew from an American reality television show about paranormal phenomena spent 3 consecutive nights in a house. The producers later admitted in an interview that they had planned a 5-day filming marathon, but after the 3rd night, 2 camera operators refused to return, citing unexplainable technical malfunctions with the equipment and personal discomfort. Notably, it was in those rooms where most complaints of discomfort were recorded that extensive mold colonies were later discovered behind the decorative panels. The Winchester Mansion still stands today, beautiful, ornate, and completely open to visitors from 9 in the morning until 5 in the evening. The administration kindly warns that some routes may be closed due to restoration work. The house is never truly finished. It is now being maintained by restorers who approach it with just as much obsession as Sarah did. The interior is so exquisitely preserved that the mansion seems ready to keep you as well, forever, in one of its 1,842 rooms. That's how many there were according to historians' initial calculations, before some were ultimately filled in during renovations. It is recommended to stick to the tour route and under no circumstances lag behind the group, not because something terrible awaits you, but because it is absolutely possible to get lost in 160 rooms with 760 doors. And while you are being searched for, the house will have plenty of time to form its own opinion of you. Our next stop on the tour will take us across the Atlantic to the misty counties of England, where, amidst the hills of Yorkshire, stands a mansion that locals have been avoiding for centuries, and those few who dared to inhabit it invariably left faster than they could unpack their belongings. If the Winchester kills you with its labyrinth, our next subject prefers to work with history, a long, dense, and utterly merciless one. History 2. Burghley House, a home where history weighs more than stones. Yorkshire, North England. There are places where the past does not just exist, it weighs down. Physically, tangibly, like the damp fog that descends upon the hills of this county in October and does not lift until March. Burghley House has stood on the edge of the village of Burghley and Wortley since 1688, meaning for more than 330 years, and all this time, it has never allowed its inhabitants to forget who the true master is here. The driveway to the house is lined with elms of such monstrous antiquity that their roots have long broken through the cobblestone and now rise above the ground like finger joints, like something is trying to claw its way out from beneath the earth and almost succeeding. The elms arch overhead into a tunnel through which light barely filters on a gray day, and by the time the driveway finally ends and the house stands before you, a very definite feeling has already taken shape. You have come where you were not invited. The Burleigh House appears, at first glance, to be a model of an English estate in the late Baroque style. Stern gray limestone, tall rectangular windows arranged in rows, symmetrical wings extending on either side of the central building, and neat balustrades around the perimeter of the roof. Everything is geometrically precise, and everything exudes an aristocratic restraint. This is the complete opposite of the chaos of Sarah Winchester, making it all the more deceptive. Where Winchester honestly warns with her chaos, something is not right here. Burleigh House gazes back at you with the inscrutable dignity of someone who knows how to wait. The history of the house begins with Sir Richard Ball, a wealthy landowner who built the original structure at the end of the 17th century on the site of a significantly earlier medieval estate. The medieval foundations were incorporated into the new construction, a decision that architects of the time found economically sensible, while all subsequent inhabitants of the house had every reason to deem it a catastrophic mistake. These foundations descend deep into the earth, to a depth that no restoration expedition has been able to establish. The latest attempt, made in 1993, revealed that beneath the southern wing of the house lie at least 3 levels of underground chambers of varying ages, the lowest of which dates back to approximately the 12th or 13th century. What exactly was used in these cellars during the Middle Ages is difficult to ascertain, as documentation from that period has either not survived or has been deliberately destroyed. Local historians, however, eagerly fill this gap with legends that the land beneath Burleigh House was a site for pagan rituals long before the arrival of the first Norman settlers. How accurate this is remains a matter of debate, but one thing is certain: the underground part of the house is clearly more extensive and ancient than anticipated at the time of its construction. The Ball family owned the house for less than 50 years, after which the estate passed to the Saville family, one of the most influential aristocratic families in Yorkshire. It was under the Savilles that the house took on the form that remains to this day, and it was under the Savilles that the story began which transformed Burleigh House from just an old estate into something considerably more intriguing from the perspective of our guidebook. In 1724, Lady Anna Saville, a 22-year-old young wife of the 3rd Baronet Saville, died in the eastern wing of the house under circumstances that the family never officially commented on. The official version, recorded in the parish records of St. Peter's Village Church, cited fever, a diagnosis that served in the 18th century as a convenient explanation for everything that medicine preferred not to investigate too closely. The unofficial version, whispered from generation to generation by local residents, was significantly less straightforward. According to accounts from the villagers of that time, later recorded by historian Thomas Whitehead in his little-known work, The Legends of Worthley, Lady Anne behaved extremely strangely in the last few weeks of her life. She refused to leave the East Wing, did not allow maids to enter her rooms, talked to someone invisible in the long corridor on the 2nd floor, and shortly before her death demanded that all mirrors in her chambers be covered with dark fabric. The servants who entered to clean her rooms consistently reported a strong, unpleasant odor that could not be eliminated by any means, as well as a feeling of acute anxiety that arose upon entering the East Wing at any time of day or night. After Lady Anne's death, several of the more superstitious servants refused to continue working in the house and quit, which, by the standards of the 18th century, when servants valued their positions much more than today, speaks volumes in itself. A rational explanation for what was happening to Lady Anne and her servants is likely related to the peculiarities of ventilation in the East Wing and the nature of the underground rock formations beneath this part of the foundation. Geological studies conducted in the 20th century revealed that the East Wing stands directly above a natural karst cavity of significant volume, filled with stagnant water. The decomposition of organic matter in such a cavity is accompanied by the release of hydrogen sulfide and methane, which in small concentrations can cause nausea, headaches, increasing anxiety, and, with prolonged exposure, neurological disturbances, including hallucinations and acute psychotic states. At concentrations above a certain level, hydrogen sulfide becomes lethally dangerous. The characteristic smell of hydrogen sulfide, described as the odor of rotten eggs or the smell of a swamp, explains what the servants repeatedly mentioned in their testimonies. The fever that claimed Lady Anne's life could very well have been acute gas poisoning in a poorly ventilated space above the karst cavity. This explanation, however, did not hinder subsequent generations of the house's inhabitants from adding new episodes to its history. The Saville family owned Burghley House until the early 20th century, and the chronicles of that period are filled with accounts of extraordinary events. In 1841, Sir Edward Saville, the 6th Baronet, carried out a complete reconstruction of the East Wing, officially due to the outdated condition of the structures, but unofficially, as local historians believe, in an attempt to rid the wing of its acquired reputation. The reconstruction, which cost a fortune, proved to be of no help. Just 1 year after its completion, the new housekeeper, Mrs. Harriet Bramley, submitted her resignation, citing the impossibility of performing duties in a house where footsteps are heard in empty corridors at night. Sir Edward replied to her in a letter preserved in a private archive. "I hear them too. I implore you not to mention this outside the estate." In 1906, the last representative of the Saville family sold Burghley House to an industrialist from Leeds named Arthur Crompton, who moved into the estate with his young wife and 3 children. Crompton stayed in the house for 14 months. What happened during those 14 months is documented by several sources: letters from Crompton to his business partner James Barlow, testimony from a housemaid named Edna Turner given years later to a local journalist, and a brief note in the Yorkshire newspaper The Morning Post from February 1908, reporting that the well-known Leeds entrepreneur Mr. A. Crompton has put his estate Burghley House up for sale, having acquired it just over a year ago. From Crompton's letters to Barlow, it appears that the first few weeks in the house were completely calm, and the new owner was quite pleased with his purchase. However, approximately 2 months after moving in, his eldest son Reginald, who was 11 at the time, began to complain of nightmares and refused to sleep in his room located in the eastern wing. "The boy insists that someone stands at his window at night and watches him," Crompton wrote. "I explained this away as a result of his sensitive nature and changed his room. Unfortunately, this did not help." A month later, Crompton himself reported that he began to experience an inexplicable reluctance to remain in the house after dark, and that his wife had stopped leaving her chambers, citing persistent headaches and a general malaise. Edna Turner, the housemaid, recounted in her later testimony that around this same time, all the servants in the estate began to notice a shared phenomenon. In the long corridor of the second floor of the eastern wing, the very same one where Lady Anna Saville once conversed with an invisible companion, a smell, which she described as the scent of a marsh after rain, would sometimes arise, and that following this scent, everyone who stayed in that corridor for too long suffered headaches lasting until the next morning. The Crompton family left Burghley House in January 1908, explaining their departure as a change in business circumstances. After Crompton, the house changed hands several more times at a similar pace. No one stayed longer than 2 years. During World War I, the estate was used as a hospital for wounded officers, and this period turned out to be perhaps the only time in the house's history when complaints of paranormal activities virtually ceased. The military personnel evidently dealt with enough real horrors to ignore the smell in the corridor and footsteps behind the walls. After the war, the house was transferred to a charitable foundation, partially restored and open to the public as a historical monument. It is in this capacity, as a historical monument with a rich tour program, that Burghley House exists today. Visitors are shown the grand hall adorned with portraits of the Saville family, the library featuring authentic 18th century books, the kitchen facilities, and several state bedrooms. The eastern wing is not included in the tours, officially due to ongoing restoration work, although local residents, with whom the author of these lines had the opportunity to speak, claim that there have been no restoration activities there for at least 20 years. In 2014, a group of students from the University of Leeds studying architectural history received special permission to examine the eastern wing during the daytime. 3 of them later described in a report the same feeling of increasing anxiety as they progressed down the corridor on the second floor, anxiety that, according to their own admission, was not linked to anything specific or visible. One of the students, Mark Holloway, recorded in his diary, "It felt as if the air in the corridor was getting heavier with each step. By the middle of the corridor, I felt as though I was walking against a very strong wind, even though there was no wind at all." Instruments the students brought with them detected a slight but consistent rise in the background level of carbon dioxide in this part of the building, which aligns with the hypothesis of gas emissions from an underground karst cavity. Burley House is beautiful, historically significant, and completely uninterested in your well-being. Its politeness is that of a very old person who knows everything they need to know about you even before you open your mouth. It is recommended to visit it only as part of an organized tour, strictly adhere to the established route, and immediately exit the building if you notice a smell remotely resembling a swamp. This is not superstition, it's basic toxicology. Our next route takes us significantly further east, where in the mountains of Transylvania stands a castle, the very name of which has become synonymous with horror. But if you think you know its history because you've read Bram Stoker or watched too many films with Bela Lugosi, let me assure you that the true story of this place is far scarier than any fiction. Story 3. Bran Castle, the home Dracula never saw, but which will still kill you. Transylvania, Romania. There's a special kind of tourist disappointment known to anyone who has ever visited a famous site with high expectations only to discover something significantly less impressive than anticipated. The Leaning Tower of Pisa turns out to be small. The Mona Lisa is tiny. Niagara Falls is loud, but somehow too touristy. Bran Castle creates strictly the opposite impression. You arrive with a set of clichés about Dracula, vampires, and cheap horror set designs, and instead find something that immediately renders those clichés meaningless. Bran Castle does not need a fictional vampire to be frightening. It has its own history, and it works far more effectively than any Gothic literature. The castle stands on a rocky outcrop about 30 meters above the valley of the Turku River at the mountain pass connecting Transylvania with Wallachia. It can be seen from afar. The white walls and red-tiled roofs contrast with the dark spruce forest surrounding the rock on all sides. And, on a clear day, this scene looks almost magical, just like castles are painted in children's illustrated books, when something enchanting and beautiful is depicted. Approaching the castle somewhat changes your impression. The road leading to its gates winds along a steep slope past souvenir vendors, selling plastic vampires, t-shirts with Dracula, and garlic in decorative bundles, and by the time you finally arrive at the gates, you already have a strong sense that the tourism industry has done everything possible to turn this place into an attraction. Step inside. The attraction ends immediately. The inner courtyard of Bran Castle is tight and enclosed, just like medieval fortresses were built with no thought for the comfort of their inhabitants, purely with the idea that it should be as difficult as possible for enemies inside. The walls rise steeply to a height of 4 to 5 stories, the windows are narrow and deep like arrow slits, and the only source of natural light is a small rectangular patch of sky overhead, which on a cloudy day takes on that specific gray-white color that meteorologists call overcast, while writers of Gothic novels refer to it as the sky above a cursed place. The space here works exactly as medieval military architects intended. It overwhelms and disorients. Even knowing that the castle is a museum and that several dozen other tourists are around you, it is impossible to shake off the feeling of being trapped. Bran Castle was built in the year 1377 at the behest of Saxon merchants from Brașov, who received permission from the Hungarian King Louis I to construct a fortified outpost for protecting the trade route. The construction took place on the site of an earlier wooden fortification and lasted several decades. As a result, the castle absorbed various construction periods, which explains its somewhat chaotic layout. Rooms are located at different levels, connected by stairs of varying steepness and direction, and some rooms can only be accessed through others by ducking under low doorways. This is not an architectural whim like that of Sarah Winchester. This is the logic of medieval military fortification, in which any complexity in layout worked against potential invaders. The problem is that it also works against the modern tourist, with roughly the same efficiency. Now about Dracula. Because this topic cannot be avoided, although it is here that history becomes the most treacherous. Bram Stoker wrote his novel in the year 1897, never personally visiting Transylvania. His research was purely library-based. He worked with geographical directories, historical studies, and travelers' accounts. The description of Count Dracula's castle in the novel does not correspond to Bran Castle in any significant detail. Bram Stoker never mentioned Bran in his working notes or correspondence. The connection between Bran Castle and the literary Dracula was established much later, approximately in the 1970s, through the efforts of Romania's tourism industry, which rightly believed that having a Dracula's castle in the country would significantly enhance its advertising campaigns. And it worked. The real historical figure commonly associated with the image of Dracula is Vlad III, known as Vlad Tepes, the ruler of Wallachia who reigned in the 15th century. He apparently never lived in Bran Castle. There is evidence that he may have spent a few days there in 1462, either as a prisoner or as a passing guest, though this assumption is based on indirect sources and is disputed by historians. Vlad Tepes became infamous for impaling his enemies, a method of execution that he employed on such a scale that contemporaries nicknamed him Tepes, meaning the impaler. Estimates suggest that during his reign, thousands to tens of thousands of people met their end in this manner, a range that reflects both the inaccuracies of medieval sources and the fact that even the most cautious of these estimates sound convincing enough to understand that we are dealing not with a literary character, but with a very real man who had very real methods. The history of Bran Castle during the 15th to 17th centuries is a chronicle of continuous military conflicts, changes of ownership, and destruction. The castle passed back and forth between Hungarian kings, Transylvanian princes, and Ottoman conquerors, and each new owner first reinforced the walls and expanded the underground chambers. The underground part of the castle, several levels of dark, low rooms partially carved into the rock, was used at different periods as a storage facility, a prison, and a site for executions. Today, visitors are shown the underground levels under dim, artificial lighting, and even in these conditions, many tourists prefer not to linger longer than necessary. The walls are damp and cold even in the summer heat, the ceilings are low, and the acoustics are such that any sound, footsteps, voices, a random cough, echoes off the stone surfaces and returns to you in slightly altered form, as if someone quietly repeats your words just behind you. The most notable episode in the recent history of the castle is connected to the Romanian royal family. In 1920, Bran Castle was gifted to Queen Marie of Romania, the granddaughter of British Queen Victoria, in recognition of her contributions during World War I. Marie was a woman of exceptional energy and extraordinary taste. She undertook a major renovation of the castle, transforming the medieval fortress into something reminiscent of a romantic residence in the fashion of the time for all things medieval, adding central heating, electricity, and modern furniture. The castle blossomed around her. Photographs from that period show bright, spacious rooms with large windows, fresh flowers in vases, and carpets on the stone floors. Maria sincerely loved this place and referred to it as her favorite among all the royal residences. She passed away in 1938, bequeathing the castle to her daughter, Princess Ileana. Princess Ileana owned it until 1948, when the communist regime nationalized all royal properties. The princess was exiled from the country, the castle was handed over to the state, and it was partially used as a museum, partially as a residence for official guests. After the fall of communism, the castle was returned to the heirs of the royal family in 2006, and since then, it is operated as a private museum. It was during the period between 1948 and 2006 that the castle acquired a reputation its current owners would prefer to keep under wraps. Several former employees of the State Museum, who gave interviews to Romanian journalists in the 90s, described similar experiences: a feeling of presence in empty rooms, the sounds of footsteps in the corridors after the museum closed, and unexplained temperature fluctuations in the underground chambers. Museum keeper Constantine Moga, who worked at the castle from 1962 to 1979, shared in an interview with the newspaper Evenimentul Zilei that he had become accustomed to hearing footsteps at night on the third floor of the northern tower, in a room that had been locked and empty during his time. According to him, he stopped paying attention to this after about a year of work, and subsequently perceived these sounds as something normal. "The castle is alive," he said in the interview. "It's just that not all the residents are visible." The most thoroughly documented case involves a group of French parapsychologists who received permission from the Romanian authorities in 1984 to conduct research in the castle, officially described as part of a study on popular superstitions as a social phenomenon, which was the only formulation acceptable to the communist administration. A 5-person team led by Professor Jean-Pierre Leclerc spent 3 nights in the castle. The report on this research, published in a limited run of a French academic journal in 1986, contains several interesting observations. Firstly, all 5 participants independently reported feelings of acute anxiety in the underground areas, significantly exceeding what could be explained by claustrophobia or darkness. Secondly, 2 participants experienced vivid hypnagogic hallucinations during the night from the 2nd to the 3rd day of their stay at the castle, visual images appearing at the threshold between wakefulness and sleep, featuring the same content, a dark silhouette by the window. Thirdly, and most interestingly from a scientific perspective, temperature measurements in underground areas revealed abnormal and irregular fluctuations that did not correlate with the external air temperature. According to Leclerc, this could indicate unknown ventilation channels in the bedrock through which air was entering from deep karst cavities. The rational explanation for most phenomena at Bhangarh Castle, much like in the case of Burleigh House, lies in geology. The castle is situated on a rocky outcrop permeated with cracks and natural cavities, which allows for continuous gas exchange with the underlying rock. The uneven flow of cold air from these cavities creates temperature anomalies that explain the sudden chill experienced in enclosed spaces. The acoustics of the stone walls and low vaulted ceilings account for the auditory phenomena observed. Hypnagogic hallucinations in people sleeping in unusual settings under low temperatures and elevated carbon dioxide levels are well documented in medical literature. None of this makes Bhangarh Castle any less interesting to visit. On the contrary, an understanding of the mechanisms behind the legend only makes it more thrilling. Just don't stay after closing time. And definitely do not request to see the underground areas after sunset. The administration will refuse, and this will be one of the few instances where tourist policy coincides perfectly with common sense. Bhangarh Castle continues to welcome several 100,000 tourists each year. Most of them leave satisfied, pocketing a plastic vampire and snapping a photo against the medieval walls. The castle bids farewell to each of them with the same stony calm of a person who has outlived Hungarian kings, Ottoman conquerors, communists, and will now outlive you, without the slightest effort or regret. Our next stop will take us even further east, to Japan, where in Fukushima Prefecture stands a house where nothing frightening occurs at all. Nothing that can be explained by gases, mold, or acoustics. Just the people living in it have a strange habit of not staying there for too long. Story 4. The Inunaki House, a village that does not exist, and a house that should not be there. Osaka Prefecture, Japan. Before discussing the house itself, it's essential to talk about the road leading to it, because the road here is part of the danger in a not metaphorical but completely literal sense. Somewhere in the mountains northeast of the city of Kishiwada, where the paved highway gives way to a dirt road, and the dirt road transforms into an overgrown path, there stands a sign. This sign is completely official, erected by local authorities, and it reads roughly as follows: "Beyond this point, the laws of Japan do not apply." This is, of course, a legal absurdity. Japan's laws are applicable throughout the entire country without any exceptions, and yet the sign remains, and locals take it with a seriousness usually reserved for warnings about landslides or poisonous snakes. At the sign begins the territory that the Japanese call Inunaki Mura, the village of Inunaki. Officially, this village does not exist. It is not listed on any modern map or in any administrative registry. Historically, a village by that name did exist in the Inunaki Mountains, a small settlement that was completely abandoned in the middle of the 20th century when the last residents moved to the cities. The roads leading to it were no longer maintained, electricity was turned off, and telephone lines were removed. The village as an administrative unit ceased to exist. However, according to a persistent urban legend widespread throughout the Kansai region and long since transcended into the realms of internet folklore beyond Japan, there remains one house in the deserted village, and in this house, someone lives. Versions regarding who exactly lives in this non-existent village vary, with the picturesque inconsistency typical of all urban legends that have passed through generations of storytellers. According to one version, the house is inhabited by a hermit or a group of hermits who have deliberately severed ties with modern society, living by their own rules, hence the sign proclaiming the laws do not apply. Another version suggests that a religious sect hides in the village, practicing rituals incompatible with the criminal code. A third version posits that the house simply stands empty, but visitors who manage to reach it invariably return with signs of acute psychological disturbance or do not return at all. The fourth version, the most popular in Japanese internet communities dedicated to the paranormal, proposes that there are beings living there who are not quite human, and for this reason, the laws written for humans do not apply to them. What if this is true? Answering this question is difficult for one simple reason. Most people who have attempted to reach Inunakimura either found nothing, just overgrown forest and remnants of foundations, or discovered enough to prefer not to elaborate on it. Japanese culture differs from Western culture in this regard. While an American adventurer might write a detailed report in a blog, a Japanese person would likely remain silent. Silence, in this case, is informative on its own. To understand the nature of this place, one must grasp the concept of Japanese kimoi, a word that roughly translates as creepy or disgusting, but carries a specific nuance related to the disruption of the natural order of things. In Japanese urban mythology, Inunakimura embodies the quintessence of kimoi. It is a place where something went terribly wrong so long ago and so thoroughly that the very space around it has become deformed. This is not Western Gothic with castles and ghosts. It is a different, subtler kind of horror, closer to the films of Hideo Nakata or the early works of Takashi Shimizu, where what is frightening is not so much what is happening, but the unsettling knowledge that something is indeed happening, yet you cannot grasp what it is. The history of the real Inunaki village is reconstructed from fragments. The settlement is believed to have originated during the Edo period, between the 17th and 19th centuries, as a mountain village of charcoal burners and hunters who lived quite isolated from the rest of the world, allowing them to develop their own traditions and customs. During the Meiji period, when Japan was actively modernizing and centralizing, such isolated communities faced significant social pressure. Their residents were considered backward, their customs savage, and they themselves regarded as inferior people within the rigid social stratification of the era. It is from these communities that Japanese folklore drew the images of mountain people, beings who were once human but became something else due to long isolation and the harsh life in the mountains. A key event linked to the sinister reputation of this place dates back to 1971. That year, a young man named Kazuhira Matsumoto, his name and circumstances have been reconstructed from police archives in Osaka, was found dead a few kilometers from a location known as Inunaki Village. The circumstances of his death were never officially clarified. The body was discovered by a group of hikers, forensic examination found no signs of violence, and the cause of death was deemed a heart attack. Matsumoto was 23 years old and, according to his family, was in good health. Shortly before his final hike, he told friends he intended to find the legendary village he had heard about from locals. That is the only verified detail known about this episode. In the 80s and 90s, with the rise of the Japanese culture of kimodameshi, literally tests of courage, a tradition of night visits to frightening places that became particularly popular among the youth during this period, Inunaki Village turned into a must-visit destination for the most daring thrill-seekers in the Kansai region. Most expeditions ended without incident. People arrived at abandoned foundations, took photos against their backdrop, and returned. Some found an old house, or what remained of it, and also came back. However, a few cases stand out. In 1989, a group of 4 young people from Osaka, Takeshi Ogawa, Hiroshi Fujita, and 2 others whose names are not mentioned in the sources, set out for Inunaki Village at night. 3 returned the next morning. The fourth, Takeshi Ogawa, was found by police 2 days later in a state of acute psychotic episode on the roadside, approximately 12 kilometers from the presumed location of the village. According to Ogawa, he had separated from the group in the dark, got lost, and spent the night in the forest, where something happened to him that he cannot talk about. He spent several weeks in the hospital. His subsequent story is unknown. Japan's personal data protection system for medical affairs functions far more effectively than in most Western countries. In 2003, a documentary film crew from a small Japanese television company attempted to record material about Inunaki village. Video footage of their expedition, or parts of it, later appeared online and continues to resurface on Japanese platforms to this day. The recording shows a group of 3 individuals with a camera moving along a forest path, gradually losing their bearings. The cameraman comments on the unfolding events in a calm, professional voice for about 20 minutes. Then, an old wooden house comes into view, tilted, with a collapsed roof and an overgrown yard. The cameraman takes a few steps toward the house. At this point, the recording cuts off. The film crew returned intact. The participants refused to comment on the content of the recording, citing technical reasons for its incompleteness. The rational explanation for the phenomena of Inunaki village differs somewhat from the explanations we applied to our previous subjects, as the main part of the magic here is created not by architecture or geology, but by psychology. The mountain forest itself is a powerful source of sensory disorientation. The lack of stable reference points, the background noise from the wind and animals, variable lighting beneath the tree canopy, and the inherent difficulty of navigating unfamiliar terrain, these factors create conditions under which even a perfectly healthy person begins to experience escalating anxiety far faster than they would like. Add to this the strong cultural context. A person is heading to a place about which they have heard frightening stories, and the mechanism of self-suggestion activates long before they reach their destination. The brain, already attuned to a threat, finds it everywhere, in the random snap of a branch, in unexpected movement in peripheral vision, in the feeling of being watched from behind the trees. However, there is one element in the story of Inunaki village that does not lend itself to such a simple explanation: the sign itself. The sign about the inapplicability of laws. Who placed it? When? For what purpose? Official sources do not provide answers to these questions. Local authorities deny any involvement in its installation. Yet the sign remains, according to the latest information available to this author, and tourists continue to photograph it. Perhaps this is a prank by someone, which has since become part of the urban legend. Perhaps it is a warning, the meaning of which is understood only by those who already know what they are being warned against. In any case, this is the only sign on the road to Inunaki village. And if the local authorities have not removed it by now, they may believe it does more good than harm. Inunaki village does not invite visitors, it is not advertised, does not sell souvenirs, and does not have an official website with hours of operation. It simply exists, or does not exist, in the mountains northeast of Kishiwada, beyond a sign that tells you what all other places in our guidebook preferred to communicate silently. This, upon reflection, is perhaps the most honest approach of all. On the next page of our journey, we leave Asia and fly to Louisiana, where, in the swamps of the Mississippi Delta, stands a plantation house of such perfect beauty that it is simultaneously unbearable. Even the most seasoned historians prefer to visit it exclusively during daylight hours and strictly by appointment. History 5. Myrtles Plantation, a house where the past does not let go. St. Francisville, Louisiana, United States of America. There is a special kind of beauty that causes pain, not metaphorically but almost physically, like too bright a light after a long darkness. Myrtles Plantation possesses just that kind of beauty. A long drive lined with live oaks draped in Spanish moss, hanging from the branches down to the ground, creates a cinematic scene so striking that you almost expect a film crew to appear from around the corner. The white house at the end of the driveway, featuring 2-tiered porches enveloped in wisteria, ornate wrought iron railings, and tall French windows that open right onto the lawn, is precisely what a Hollywood set designer would create when tasked with depicting the ideal South. Magnolias bloom here from May to July, and during these months, the air around the house is so saturated with the scent of their flowers that some visitors begin to feel dizzy. Dizziness, however, is quite a natural phenomenon here, and magnolias are not to blame. Myrtles Plantation was founded in 1796 by General David Bradford, one of the leaders of the Whiskey Rebellion of 1794, who fled to Louisiana from federal persecution after the rebellion was suppressed. Bradford chose a location with impeccable practical instinct as a planter. The high bank above the swamps provided protection from spring floods, the fertile soil was suitable for growing cotton and sugarcane, and proximity to the Mississippi allowed access to trade routes. He named his estate Beaufort, built a wooden house, and began farming. Nothing in this story so far indicates anything unusual, just the ordinary tale of an American planter of the late 18th century, of which there were hundreds in Louisiana. The unusual began later, when the house passed to Bradford's son-in-law, Judge Clark Woodruff, and his wife, Sarah, née Bradford. Judge Woodruff was a man of his time and place. He owned several dozen slaves, managed the plantation with the ruthless efficiency that the era deemed normal, and, according to contemporary accounts, was known to abuse his power over those who could not resist him. Among the slaves owned by Woodruff was a young woman named Chloe. Various sources suggest that she was either a personal servant to his wife or the judge's mistress, or perhaps occupied both roles to the extent that such a combination was possible in a system that afforded her no choice. The story of Chloe is central to understanding what continues to unfold in the house today, and it is also the most painful part of this tale, because behind the layer of paranormal legend lies a very real human tragedy that does not need any mystical explanation to be terrifying. According to the legend, Chloe was once caught eavesdropping at the door of Judge Woodruff's office. As punishment, her ear was cut off. After that, she began to wear a green turban to conceal her injury, a detail that later became her identifying mark in numerous accounts of paranormal phenomena in the house. According to another version of the same legend, Chloe intentionally added leaves of oleander, a poisonous plant commonly found in Louisiana, to a festive cake baked for the Woodruff family, attempting to induce mild illness in the family members, which she thought would give her the chance to show care and win back the owner's favor. Her dosage calculations were off. The judge's wife and two of his children died. Chloe was hanged by other slaves who feared collective punishment for her actions, and her body was thrown into the river. The authenticity of this story is a question that seriously occupies historians. No documentary evidence confirming Chloe's existence, her punishment, or her alleged crime has been found in the archives of Louisiana. Historian Heidi Hollingsworth, specializing in the history of Southern plantations, notes in her 2012 work that such narratives, a slave poisoning a white family, were prevalent in the American South as types of cautionary tales functioning within the system of racial control. This does not mean such incidents did not occur. They certainly did, but the specific story of Chloe in its current form may be a later compilation of several real events, enhanced with folk elements. However, the deaths of Judge Woodruff's wife and children are documented. They died just a few days apart, which could have indeed been the result of poisoning, though the official cause of death was termed yellow fever, which ravaged Louisiana in the first half of the 19th century, with a frequency sufficient to explain any sudden death. After the deaths of his wife and children, Judge Woodruff lived in the house for several more years and was shot by an unknown assailant on the steps of his own porch in 1841. The murderer was never found. The house changed hands several times during the second half of the 19th century and was eventually acquired in 1975 by James and Marley Myers, who undertook a massive restoration and opened it as an inn and tourist attraction. It was the Myers who introduced the modern name, Myrtles Plantation, and it was under their ownership that the reputation of the house as one of the most haunted places in America took the shape it holds today. The accounts of paranormal phenomena in the Myrtle House are so numerous, diverse, and well documented that a complete list would fill a separate book, and such books, it should be noted, exist. Let's focus on some of the most illustrative episodes. In 1980, a young couple from New Orleans, Robert and Susan Cummings, rented a room in the house for 2 nights. Susan Cummings later described in a letter to the hotel management what she characterized as a completely real and inexplicable event. At 3 o'clock in the morning, She woke up feeling someone's presence in the room and saw a female figure in a green headdress near the mirror, watching her. The figure was clear enough for Susan to see details of the clothing, remaining visible for several seconds before disappearing. Robert Cummings, awakened by his wife's screams, saw nothing. The hotel management, upon receiving the letter, added it to the growing archive of similar accounts. In 1987, a guest at the hotel, traveling alone, was photographing the interiors of the house. In one of the film photographs taken in the foyer, a figure of a woman in an antique dress appeared, which was not visible at the time of the shoot. The photograph was sent for examination to the photo laboratory of Louisiana State University, where specialists determined that the film had not undergone any mechanical processing and that the image was not the result of double exposure. The experts preferred not to comment on what exactly the camera had captured. The photograph is still preserved in the plantation archive and is shown to visitors. In the 90s, a research group led by parapsychologist Louise Stanton conducted a series of nighttime observations in the house, the results of which were published in a specialized journal. The group recorded several anomalies worth noting. First, in several rooms of the house, especially in the one believed to have been Chloe's room, thermal sensors regularly detected localized drops in temperature by several degrees in the absence of any air movement. Second, on the night of the second to third day of observations, audio recording equipment picked up sounds in the empty corridor on the second floor, interpreted by the group as footsteps and a soft, feminine voice. The recording was played back on several independent devices and deemed authentic, meaning it was not an artifact of the equipment. The content of what the voice was saying could not be deciphered. Third, 2 participants from the group independently reported feelings of touch on their shoulders in the first-floor room where, according to legend, Judge Woodruff's children died. While respecting the scientific rigor of Stanton's group, it is necessary to note that subjective feelings of touch are among the most common manifestations of the hypnagogic state and cannot be regarded as evidence of anything beyond neurophysiology. Nevertheless, the collection of documented anomalies is intriguing enough to take seriously. Rational explanations for the phenomena at Myrtles Plantation exist, as always, and, as always, they do not account for everything. The house is built on marshy soil rich in organic matter, creating conditions for constant gas emissions and temperature anomalies in the crawl space. The old wooden structures in Louisiana's climate, with its extreme humidity, sharp temperature fluctuations, and abundant mold cultures, create an acoustic environment filled with unexpected and hard-to-explain sounds. Spanish moss, which hangs in large quantities from the trees around the house, provides an ideal breeding ground for fungi, some of which produce volatile organic compounds with neuroactive properties. In other words, just breathing the air around Myrtles Plantation is already hazardous from a neurochemical perspective. But there is another layer to this story that science is unwilling to explain, and that is the historical layer. Myrtles Plantation stands on land that has witnessed slavery in all its brutal, daily inhumanity for nearly 70 years. People worked here under conditions that modern individuals cannot fully imagine or endure. They were born, lived, and died within a radius of a few hundred meters of this beautiful white house, stripped of rights, protection, and any hope for a change in their situation. If anything can saturate a place with an ineffable residue of human suffering, it is precisely such a history. Whether to call it energy, the memory of the place, or simply the psychological pressure of collective historical trauma on visitors aware of this story, is a matter of terminology. The fact is that Myrtles Plantation exerts pressure. It combines beauty and history in a way that proves heavier than either factor alone. Today, Myrtles Plantation is one of the most popular inns in Louisiana. Rooms are booked months in advance, with the most expensive ones, those where paranormal phenomena are most frequently reported, selling out first. Many more people wish to spend a night in the house where Chloe was seen wearing a green turban than there are rooms available. The management happily shares the story of the plantation during candlelit evening tours. The house welcomes this attention with the same serene beauty that has greeted sunrises over the swamps for over 200 years. It is not in a hurry. It has time for everyone. The next chapter of our guide will take us to Scotland, where on a windswept island stands a castle whose history is so filled with violence, betrayal, and tragedy that the locals long ago ceased to be surprised by what occurs within its walls at night. They simply try to avoid being there after sunset. Story 6. Glamis Castle, a house where a secret is bricked up in the wall. Angus, Scotland. There are castles that frighten with their abandonment, empty, eyeless windows, crumbling walls, and the silence of long deserted halls. Glamis Castle, however, instills fear in a fundamentally different way. It is inhabited. It is well maintained. It welcomes tourists from May to October, serving excellent scones with clotted cream in its tea room, and in its gift shop, you can buy jam with the castle's logo and woolen blankets in the Lion Clan's tartan. This is what makes it truly terrifying. The fact that behind all this cozy Scottish hospitality, behind portraits in heavy gilded frames and polished brass candlesticks, lies a secret that the owning family has been guarding for centuries and seems determined to keep forever. Glamis is one of the oldest inhabited castles in Scotland. The first mention of a castle on this site dates back to the 11th century. It was here, according to chronicles, that King Malcolm II was murdered in the year 1042, the very same king whose death served as the starting point for Shakespeare's Macbeth, although the playwright took considerable liberties with historical facts, as is well known. The current structure of the castle was mainly built between the 14th and 17th centuries and consists of a complex of towers, wings, and extensions constructed in different eras, with that organic inconsistency typical of buildings that evolve alongside the history of their owners rather than according to a predetermined plan. On the outside, the castle looks precisely like an ideal Scottish castle should. Grey stone crowned with a forest of towers and spires, a wide park with ancient trees, and a long driveway where deer graze on misty mornings. When Shakespeare wrote his Macbeth, he was undoubtedly envisioning something like this, although Glamis Castle, by the way, has surpassed any Shakespearean tragedy in terms of actual deaths per square meter. The Lion-Bowes family has owned Glamis since the year 1372, when John Lyon received the castle as a gift from Scottish King Robert II and secured his rights to it by marrying the royal daughter. Since then, the castle has been passed down through inheritance continuously for over 6 centuries, enduring Jacobite uprisings, religious wars, raids, sieges, and all the other misfortunes of Scottish history with the stoic permanence characteristic of structures built from truly good stone. The most famous of the castle's modern inhabitants is the Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes Lyon, mother of the late Queen Elizabeth II, who was born here in 19 and kept a tender attachment to Glamis throughout her long life. Thus, the castle is officially part of British royal history, which adds a special flavor to its mystery, a blend of aristocratic restraint and state secrets that the British excel at maintaining with unmatched skill. The mystery of Glamis Castle is neither a metaphor nor a tourist legend. This is a specific and well-documented phenomenon. Within the castle, there is a bricked-up room whose existence is known to everyone, but the contents of which remain a mystery to all except a narrow circle of initiates. The tradition surrounding this room is described in several independent sources from the 19th and 20th centuries in remarkably similar ways. The secret of the castle is known only to the Earl of Strathmore, the owner of Glamis, and it is passed down exclusively through the male line, from father to heir, when the heir turns 21 years old. The family lawyer and the butler are also privy to the secret. No one else. Wives, daughters, brothers, and other family members are intentionally and permanently excluded from this knowledge. The origins of the mystery are generally traced back to the 17th century, although it is impossible to determine this precisely for obvious reasons. The most common theory suggests that a certain person, or creature, was bricked up alive in one of the castle's rooms, and for some reason could neither be killed nor set free. The theories regarding the identity of the bricked-up individual also vary. One theory claims it was one of the Lord Strathmore, born with a horrifying physical deformity that made public existence impossible. Another suggests that it was a child, who inherited something from their mother that the family preferred to hide from the world. The third, and most sinister, theory posits that it was not one individual but several, and the room was used for purposes that are best left unthought of in dark corridors. Evidence of the Glamis Castle secret appears in written sources starting from the mid-19th century. Lady Anna Monk Mason, who visited the castle in the 1860s, recorded in her diary that one day, along with other guests, she attempted to locate the bricked-up room by hanging towels out of every window that could be opened, a method intended to reveal windows behind which there was no visible space from the outside. According to her, such windows were discovered. When she mentioned the experiment in conversation with the then Earl of Strathmore, he, as she described, turned pale as if she had struck him, and abruptly ceased the conversation in such a hurried manner that was more eloquent than any words, confirming her suspicions. In the 1880s, several guests of the castle made a more systematic attempt. They compared the internal layout with the external dimensions of the building and established that the internal space was significantly smaller than the exterior. The difference was substantial enough to suggest the presence of at least a few hidden chambers. This discovery was reported to the then Earl, and he, according to one of the participants in the experiment, responded with a Scottish terseness bordering on a threat. "You have found what you should not have sought. I ask you to forget about it." Claude Beaulieu, the 13th Earl of Strathmore and the grandfather of the Queen Mother, was a deeply religious man and, according to contemporaries, an unhappy one. People who knew him closely described in their memoirs that he gave the impression of carrying a burden that prevented him from fully being present in his own life. His son, the 14th Earl, was initiated into the secret at the appropriate time, and according to his daughter Violet, who recounted this in her later years to a journalist, he returned from the conversation with his father a different person. He was depressed and silent for several days, and then he said to me, "Thank goodness you are a woman and will never know this." Violet Beaulieu, who lived a long life, insisted until her death that the secret was real and related to something physically existing in the castle rather than a documentary family secret. Paranormal phenomena at Glamis Castle, aside from the secret room, are varied and have been documented with enviable diligence, partly because the castle was never vacant and was always inhabited by people capable of keeping records. The most commonly mentioned figure is the so-called Grey Jack, or Jack with the Club, the figure of a young page who was supposedly beaten to death by one of the Lord Strathmore in the 17th century. The boy has been seen in various parts of the castle, primarily in the corridors of the West Wing, for several centuries. Testimonies about him show remarkable consistency in detail. A small figure in dark clothing, standing motionless against the wall, or slowly moving toward the staircase. In 1952, the castle maid Mary Gibbs encountered him in the corridor on the second floor of the East Wing around midnight and fainted from fright. The medical documentation of this incident has been preserved in the castle's archives. Another regularly appearing figure is the White Lady, a woman in light clothing who is seen near the family chapel in the evening hours. The chapel of Glamis Castle itself deserves a separate discussion. It was built in the 14th century, has been extensively remodeled, and contains the family burials of several generations of the Lyons. In 1937, workers conducting restoration of the chapel floors discovered a walled-off space beneath the stone slabs containing several objects, the nature of which the castle administration refused to comment on. This is all that is known about this episode from publicly available sources. In 1968, a group of students from the University of Edinburgh, engaged in historical research, received permission to work in the castle library. One of them, Andrew MacLeod, who later became a historian and published several works on Scottish architecture, recalled in a 1990 interview that one night, staying in the library later than the others, he heard from behind the wall a sound he described as rhythmic tapping, too even to be an accidental creak of the structure, and too slow to be the workings of any machinery. The tapping lasted about 20 minutes and stopped as suddenly as it had begun. MacLeod chose not to report this to the authorities, believing that no one would believe him, and he only mentioned the incident more than 20 years later. Rational explanations for the phenomena at Glamis are less convincing than in most of our previous mansions, simply because the existence of the bricked-up space is an established fact, not a mere speculation. Acoustic anomalies in old stone buildings with voids within their walls are easy to explain. Temperature fluctuations in rooms adjacent to unnoticed internal cavities are too. The psychological impact of a place with centuries of violence and mystery on those who know its history is quite predictable. But what exactly lies within the bricked-up rooms of Glamis Castle? This rational science cannot explain, simply because no one living knows the answer to that question, except for one person, who will not say a word. Glamis Castle is open to visitors every year from May to October. The tour route is carefully planned and does not include the west wing, the basement, and several rooms on the second floor, for safety reasons. The scones in the tea room are truly excellent. Gooseberry jam is especially recommended. It's best not to hang towels out of the windows, not because it is forbidden, but because no answer will be given anyway. The walls of Glamis can keep secrets far better than all the other walls in our guidebook, and that in itself says a lot. On the next page of our journey, we move to Italy, where a hospital stands on an island in the middle of the Tiber, and its history so consistently and methodically disproves the very notion of a habitable place that its walls are infused with misfortune as uniformly and thoroughly as its basements are soaked in dampness. Story 7. Tiberina Island, a place where death works non-stop. Rome, Italy. In the middle of the Tiber, about 1 kilometer south of the Capitol Hill, lies a small island in the shape of an elongated ellipse, about 270 meters long and 67 wide, making it one of the smallest inhabited islands in Europe and, without a doubt, the most historically rich patch of land per square meter in the entire Western world. Tiberina Island, or Isola Tiberina as the Romans call it, can be seen from the banks of the Tiber in any weather. The warm ochre stone of its buildings contrasts with the dark water of the river, a medieval tower rises above the tiled roofs, and 2 ancient hospitals, one of which has been in operation for over 1,000 years, give it the appearance of permanence and rootedness that makes one think of the place as something eternal and unshakable. This impression is as deceptive as everything else in our guidebook. The history of the island begins in the year 291 BC, more than 2,300 years ago, and it begins with death. That year, Rome was ravaged by a plague that took lives with an efficiency that medieval chroniclers would later describe using the term pestilence, having no more precise term to denote a phenomenon of such magnitude. The Roman Senate, having exhausted all available human measures to combat the illness, turned to the oracle at Delphi, who advised them to bring the sacred snake of the healing god Asclepius from his main sanctuary in Epidaurus to Rome. A delegation was sent to Greece, and when the ship carrying the live snake returned up the Tiber to Rome, the sacred animal, according to the accounts of Titus Livius and several other ancient authors, left the ship on its own and swam to a small island in the middle of the river, where it hid among the riverbank foliage. This act was interpreted as a clear indication from the gods. A temple to Asclepius should be built here, and the sick should be treated here. From that moment on, the decision to place the sick where the sacred snake had arrived, the history of Tiber Island evolved into a continuous 2,000-year chronicle of illness and death. A temple to Asclepius was constructed and the epidemic ceased, possibly due to natural causes, or perhaps thanks to the actual quarantine effect of isolating the sick on the island. From then on, the island became a destination for Rome's sick, dying, and those it preferred to keep off the city streets. In the 1st century of our era, under Emperor Claudius, it was officially permitted to leave 6 slaves on the island, whom their masters did not wish to treat. The decree stated that a slave abandoned on Tiber Island and who survived without their master's aid would gain their freedom. This was one of the rare instances in Roman law where illness became a pathway to freedom, and thus, from the very beginning of its recorded history, the island was a place where human suffering and human hope existed in an inseparable bond, like 2 sides of the same coin. In the Middle Ages, when the pagan temple of Asclepius was replaced by the Christian church of St. Bartholomew, which still stands on the island today and is one of the oldest functioning churches in Rome, the tradition of treating the sick here did not cease, but merely changed its theological justification. In the 10th century, a monastery with an attached hospital was established on the island. In the 16th century, the order of Fate Bene Fratelli, the Brothers Who Do Good, founded a hospital here that is operated continuously to this day, making it one of the oldest active medical institutions in the world. The Fate Benefertelli Hospital has treated patients during all Roman epidemics since the 16th century, the plague of the 17th century, cholera in the 19th, and the Spanish flu in the 20th. Hundreds of thousands of sick individuals have passed through its doors, most of whom did not exit through the main gate but left the island another way, through a special exit to the embankment designed for transporting bodies. This exit still exists today. It is necessary to pause and discuss what exactly happens to people on Tiber Island, because what happens here literally differs from what takes place in most locations in our guidebook. Glamis Castle is shrouded in mystery. Myrtles Plantation has a history of slavery. The Inunaki Murata is marked by isolation. Tiber Island operates differently. It weighs down with continuity. When you stand on its waterfront and gaze at the Tiber River flowing by for over 2,000 years, and you realize that this small patch of land has literally never, not for a single day over 23 centuries, ceased to receive the sick and dying, you experience a feeling that is hard to describe more accurately than as dizziness from time. It is neither fear nor anxiety. It is something more fundamental, tied to the awareness of one's own vanishing smallness in the face of such a concentration of human suffering in one place. Paranormal phenomena on Tiber Island have been recorded with remarkable regularity over the centuries, and this is not surprising, considering that the number of people who have died on this island or in its immediate vicinity is estimated by the most conservative counts to be in the hundreds of thousands. The most frequently mentioned occurrences are related to water. Many residents of homes facing the Tiber and staff at the Fate Benefertelli Hospital describe the sensation that at night, when tourists are absent and the waterfront empties, sounds are heard from the water that are not characteristic of river flow, something between a soft singing and a moaning, distant enough and ambiguous enough to remain on the verge of being a real sound or an auditory illusion. The medical personnel working night shifts at the hospital approach this phenomenon with the professional composure of those accustomed to an unusually arranged work environment. The most thoroughly documented episode in the modern history of the island dates back to 1986. Italian journalist Luca Ferrari, working on a series of reports about the history of Roman hospitals, spent several days on the island, staying at a small hotel next to the Church of St. Bartholomew. In his report, published in the magazine La Repubblica in October of the same year, he described a growing feeling, throughout several days, that he characterized as the presence of layers of time pressing down. By the end of the third day, he stated that he was unable to work, he couldn't concentrate, felt an inexplicable sadness, disproportionate to any specific events, and several times found himself sitting motionless, staring at the water, having no idea how much time had passed. He left the island a day earlier than planned, describing this decision as the only reasonable one I made during this assignment. The phenomenon he described, increasing melancholy, loss of the sense of time, inability to concentrate, has a fairly precise term in psychology: effect of saturation with grief, a state arising from prolonged contact with places that carry a powerful collective emotional charge. It is experienced by workers at mass burial sites, staff in oncology departments, and anyone who spends too much time in places where sorrow is the norm rather than the exception. Another episode worth mentioning relates to the restoration work carried out at the Church of St. Bartholomew in 1994. When the builders uncovered the floors in the nave, they discovered fragments of a mosaic floor underneath the modern covering, which specialists concluded dated back to the late antique period, remnants of the original temple of Asclepius. Beneath the mosaic floor, there was a layer of ash and coal, interpreted as traces of burning, likely from cleansing fires lit during times of epidemics. Under this layer, the workers found bones, many bones. The remains were excavated, studied, and reburied with the appropriate religious rites, a standard procedure for such finds in Rome, where any construction inevitably encounters layers of previous civilizations. However, several workers involved in this project later reported that for a few nights after the excavations began, they experienced the same dreams: dark water and silhouettes of people moving along the riverbank in the darkness. This testimony is interesting not so much for the dreams themselves, which are a completely predictable psychological reaction after a hard workday involving human remains. but because four individuals who did not discuss their dreams with one another subsequently described nearly identical imagery. The underground aspect of the island deserves a separate conversation. Like most sites in our guide, Tiber Island has a significantly more extensive subterranean component than is visible on the surface. Underneath the modern buildings, there are foundations and cellars from at least three construction periods: ancient, medieval, and early Renaissance. Some of these spaces are used by the hospital for operational purposes. Some are preserved. Some, according to Italian specialists in architectural heritage protection, remain unexplored due to accessibility challenges and structural instability. It is in the cellars of the Fate Bene Fratelli Hospital that several staff members, speaking anonymously to journalists, report most of what the personnel privately refer to as strangeness. Sounds in empty corridors, inexplicable movements in peripheral vision, and a feeling of being watched from dark corners. The hospital does not officially comment on these accounts, which is entirely understandable for a medical institution concerned about maintaining a reputation for being rational and serious. A rational explanation for the phenomena of Tiber Island involves several well-understood factors. The water flowing around the island creates a constant low-frequency sound background, which under certain acoustic conditions, depending on the current speed, water level, and the architecture of the embankments, can generate infrasound waves. High humidity in the cellars contributes to the formation of mold cultures with neuroactive properties. The psychological impact of a place with a 2,000-year history of illness and death on people who are aware of this history is a predictable and well-documented phenomenon. Moreover, working in a hospital is itself one of the most psychologically demanding activities known to humanity, and the staff of any healthcare institution operating as a round-the-clock facility is vulnerable to professional burnout and the associated psychological phenomena. All of this explains a lot. However, it does not explain why, standing on the embankment of Tiber Island late at night, when tourists have left and darkness descends over the river, you can distinctly sense, not think, but feel, that this place does not belong to the living. It never did. It accommodates their presence with the same polite tolerance that a very old person reserves for children playing in their garden, good-naturedly, condescendingly, and with a full understanding that their time here is limited. The Fate Bene Fratelli Hospital operates 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The Church of St. Bartholomew is open to visitors daily. The embankment of the island is one of the most pleasant places for an evening stroll in Rome, especially in June, when there's an open-air film festival and deck chairs are set up along the banks. The island does not chase anyone away. It simply waits. It is used to it. The next page of our journey takes us far from the warm Roman sky, north to a land of white nights and black winters, where, in the forests of Karelia, there stands an estate that in Soviet times was preferred to be left unspoken, and in post-Soviet times is discussed with that caution typical of people unsure they won't be overheard. Story 8. The Hitola Estate, a house on the edge of two worlds. Karelia, Russia. There are places where the boundary between the past and the present is so thin that you start to doubt the very existence of that boundary. Karelia is one such region. This land is so ancient, so infused with layers of cultures, languages, and tragedies, that even the most ordinary roadside stone carries the imprint of something that happened long before the people capable of recording events came into being. The Finns refer to this unique Karelian air as Karjalainen kaipaus, Karelian longing, a melancholy for what is lost, and this phrase more accurately describes the sensation you feel as you enter this region via a road that winds through endless pine forests along the shores of lakes with pitch-black water. The Hitola estate stands, or more precisely what remains of it stands, on the shore of Lake Ladoga, a few kilometers from the village of the same name. Getting here is not easy. The paved road ends about 3 kilometers away, and the path ahead is unpaved, turning into what locals, with Karelian succinctness, call impassable during the spring thaw and autumn rains. In winter, the path here is covered with snow and marked only by ski tracks, which are periodically laid by a few enthusiastic individuals. This creates a natural filtering of random visitors. Only those who genuinely want to reach the Hitola estate make the journey, and this circumstance lends any visit a sense of conscious choice, which carries a special responsibility. The history of this place begins long before the current building of the estate was erected, in that layer of Karelian past that historians describe cautiously due to the catastrophic lack of documentary sources, as well as the folklore that must be used to fill in the gaps, which follows its own logic and does not always conform to academic standards of authenticity. The land surrounding the current estate was, according to Karelian runo-singers recorded in the 19th century by Elias Lönnrot and his followers, a site of special cultural and sacred significance for the ancient Karelians, one of the so-called Hitsi, places inhabited by nature spirits that occupy an intermediate position between guardian spirits and overtly dangerous beings. The very word Hitola is derived from Hitsi, literally place of Hitsi, a place belonging to the spirits, which, in itself, is a quite telling toponym for the estate we are about to describe. The Finnish estate, whose ruins have survived to this day, was built in the late 19th century by the Laaksonen family, prosperous Finnish landowners who settled in Karelia during a time when the region was part of the Grand Duchy of Finland and enjoyed a certain autonomy within the Russian Empire. The manor house was constructed in the characteristic style of the period, Finnish Romanticism, a wooden two-story structure with spacious verandas and tall windows overlooking the lake, featuring carved trim and a roof ridge adorned with traditional Karelian ornamentation. In its prime, the Laaksonen estate was exactly what it seemed, a beautiful, well-tended home in a picturesque location, where the family gathered in the summer to swim in the lake, pick blueberries, and fish. Photographs from that era, preserved in Finnish archives, show fair-haired children on the steps of the veranda, a table set for tea in the garden, and adults in light summer suits. A perfectly normal, perfectly happy picture. The first signs that this place might not be ideally chosen appeared even during construction. Workers hired to dig the foundation twice refused to continue working in a certain area of the site, specifically the spot that would later become the eastern corner of the house. They vaguely explained their refusals with statements like, "The ground here is not good. There is a cold draft coming from below," and "You can't dig here." The estate's owner, Eino Laaksonen, a practical-minded individual with a Lutheran upbringing, gave no weight to these explanations and hired other workers who completed the foundation without apparent difficulties. Later on, it became clear that in the eastern corner of the house, directly beneath the foundation, there was an outlet for an underground spring, a small stream whose water flowed into the lake through a natural channel. The locals had known about this spring for a long time and regarded it, according to Karelian tradition, as a living place, meaning a site with a special natural power that should not be disturbed by construction. Eino Laaksonen was unaware of this belief. Or perhaps he knew, but did not take it seriously, which ultimately makes no difference, as the outcome was the same. The Laaksonen family predominantly used the estate as a summer residence for about 20 years. During those 20 years, 3 people died in the house. Eino's younger son, Matti, who drowned in the lake at the age of 9 in the summer of 1900. Eino's sister, Aino, who passed away in the estate from a heart attack in 1904 at the age of 42, under circumstances the family found disturbing. The woman was perfectly healthy the evening before, yet woke up screaming in the night and fell before she could get out of bed. And one of the estate's workers, whose name is not mentioned in the surviving documents, was found dead in the eastern corner of the cellar in 1908 without any apparent cause of death. Any medical report, if it was made, has not survived. 3 deaths over 20 years in a country estate, despite the tragedy of each one, is not statistically anomalous, especially considering that drowning children and sudden heart attacks were common causes of death in an era when ambulances took 20 minutes to arrive and the nearest qualified doctor could be hours away. What makes these deaths significant for our story is their one common feature. All 3 deceased complained shortly before their deaths about the same phenomenon. Matti told his older sister that he heard a voice calling him from the lake at night. Aino, on her last evening, mentioned at dinner that someone walking in the eastern corner of the house had been keeping her awake for several nights. The worker, whose name is unknown to us, left a note in his small room in Finnish that roughly translates to, "Someone is knocking down below. I must take a look. He did take a look. He was found there. The Winter War of 1939 to 1940 and the subsequent Soviet annexation of Karelia abruptly and effectively ended the Finnish period of the estate. The Laaksonen family, like most Finnish residents in the region, was forced to leave their homes during the evacuation. They departed in a matter of days, taking only the essentials with them and leaving behind not just their home, but 3 generations of history, several decades of life, and 3 graves in the local cemetery, now left unattended. The estate came under the control of the Soviet authorities and was used in various periods with that characteristic Soviet pragmatism, which turned ancient noble estates into warehouses, collective farm offices, or pioneer camps, depending on the current administrative needs. From 1942 to 1944, when Karelia was occupied by Finnish troops during the Continuation War, the estate was used by the Finnish military as an officers' quarters. Several letters from Finnish officers of that period addressed to their families mention the Hiitola estate, albeit exclusively in a negative context. Lieutenant Paavo Heikkinen wrote home in January 1943 that he would prefer to sleep in the snow than in that damned house where something happens in the basement every night. Captain Juha Koskinen, in a letter to his wife, mentioned that several soldiers from his unit refused to stand guard at night on the first floor of the estate, citing fears unworthy of military men, yet describing what they heard so convincingly that I did not dare check their words myself. Both officers survived the war, and upon returning home, they refused to speak about the estate with anyone except their closest friends. After the war, the estate returned to Soviet ownership and gradually fell into disrepair, a standard fate for buildings that the state does not consider valuable enough for restoration and at the same time does not demolish completely. By the 1980s, the main house had lost most of its roof and second floor, the foundation had settled in several places, and the wooden structures had rotted to the point that entering became dangerous. The wings disappeared even earlier. Apparently, local residents gradually dismantled them for building materials, which was a reasonable solution given the Soviet shortages. By our time, what remains of the Hiitola estate is a stone foundation with partially destroyed walls of the first floor, several wooden supports retaining fragments of carving, and a basement, completely intact, dry and dark, with stone walls almost 1 meter thick, which will likely survive all other parts of the structure for several more centuries. It is the basement that is the center of modern stories about the Hiitola estate. Urban explorers, a subculture in Russia often referred to as stalkers, after the novel by the Strugatsky brothers, have repeatedly visited this site since the 1990s. Most of their reports, published on relevant forums, describe similar experiences: a calm, picturesque landscape, a pleasant walk to the ruins, a normal state of mind, until they approach the basement. Beyond that point, the atmosphere becomes consistently unpleasant. A researcher from St. Petersburg, known by the nickname Severny, who visited the estate alone in 2005, described in his report that he suddenly experienced a nosebleed at the entrance to the basement, a phenomenon he had never experienced before, and at the same time had such an acute feeling of another's presence behind him that he turned around without consciously deciding to do so. No one was behind. The bleeding didn't stop for about 20 minutes. He did not go into the basement. Another researcher, who visited the site in 2012 as part of a group of 3, reported that all 3 experienced the same sensation at different moments while descending into the basement, that someone was pulling them back by the shoulder. The similarity in their independent descriptions of this sensation, the direction, intensity, and the moment it occurred, was precise enough to rule out coincidence. A rational explanation for the phenomena of Hiitola largely overlaps with what we have already discussed. An underground source beneath the foundation creates conditions for constant gas activity in the soil. Lake Ladoga generates infrasound waves under certain wind and wave conditions, and the isolated forested area with zero light pollution creates optical conditions under which the human brain, with its tendency to see patterns in random noise, begins to interpret completely neutral visual stimuli as something meaningful and potentially threatening. All of this is true. It explains a lot. Except for that note left by an unnamed worker more than 100 years ago. Someone is knocking below. I must take a look. What he found down there? We will never know. The basement keeps that knowledge much more securely than Glamis Castle keeps its secret room. At least there are living people who know. Here, no one remains. The Haitola estate is unguarded, unrenovated, and not listed in any official registry of historical monuments. It simply stands on the banks of Ladoga, slowly returning to the earth from which it was raised over 120 years ago. Locals in the village of Haitola know about it, but they do not visit, not out of fear, as they explain, but simply because there is no reason to. This is perhaps the most honest assessment of all that we heard during our journey. The next chapter takes us to the other end of Europe, to Portugal, where on a rocky promontory above the Atlantic stands a palace so absurdly beautiful that the very fact of its existence seems an architectural joke, until you learn who built it, why, and what happened to it afterward. Story 9. The Palace of Quinta da Regaleira, a house where architecture is a code. Sintra, Portugal. There exists a special category of places that cannot be described without risking appearing to be someone who overuses superlatives. Sintra, in general, falls into this category, a small town 30 kilometers west of Lisbon, where Portuguese kings built summer residences starting in the 15th century, and where the concentration of palaces, parks, and architectural fantasies per square kilometer is so great that UNESCO recognized the entire urban landscape as a World Heritage Site in 1995. A case where not an individual building is protected, but the very atmosphere of the place. Quinta da Regaleira stands in Sintra as the most concentrated expression of everything that makes this town extraordinary, and at the same time as the most consistently encoded of all the places in our guide. The ascent to the palace begins on a narrow cobblestone street, steeply rising between walls overgrown with ferns and moss. The humidity here is constant. Sintra is directly influenced by the Atlantic fogs that roll in from the ocean, cling to the peaks of the Serra da Sintra, and settle into a dense mist, making the air almost tangible. It is through this haze that you approach Quinta da Regaleira, and in this fog, the palace presents itself to you for the first time, not all at once, but in fragments. First, there's the corner tower with its crenellated parapet, then an arched window adorned with Manueline decor, and finally, the entire facade appears, and you pause, because in front of you is something that your mind struggles to process as a real object. It looks like an illustration from an edition of The Lord of the Rings, created by an artist who took the author's directions literally and knew no restraint. Towers, spires, gargoyles, lace-like Manueline stonework, windows of various shapes and sizes, arranged with a seeming randomness that, upon closer inspection, reveals a carefully calculated asymmetry. All of this together creates the impression of a building constructed by a very intelligent person with very specific goals, which he never shared with anyone. This man was named Antonio Augusto Carvalho Monteiro, and he was one of the wealthiest and most enigmatic individuals in Portugal at the turn of the 20th century. The source of his fortune was the Brazilian diamond mines and coffee plantations, an inheritance from his father that he astutely increased. The source of his reputation was something else. Monteiro was a collector of rare books and manuscripts, a connoisseur of Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, Freemasonry, and alchemy, a person whose intellectual world was arranged on entirely different principles compared to his contemporaries, and who regarded esoteric knowledge not as an exotic hobby, but as a serious system for understanding the world. The nickname Monteiro the Beetle was given to him for his famous collection of insects, one of the largest in Europe at that time, but he could just as easily have earned it for another reason: his ability to penetrate the darkest and most inaccessible corners of human knowledge with the same meticulousness with which an entomologist explores the forest floor in search of a new species. In 1898, Monteiro purchased a plot of land in Sintra and hired Italian architect Luigi Manini, a theatrical designer by profession, which in itself says a lot about the effect the client intended to achieve, to create a palace and park based on his own design. Manini and Monteiro worked closely together for several years, resulting in something that has no direct analogues in European architecture. Not just a beautiful building and a beautiful park, but a three-dimensional encyclopedia of esoteric symbolism, where every element, from the shape of a window to the layout of the pathways in the park, bears coded significance. The main house is just the above-ground and most visible part of the design. The park surrounding it is a significantly more complex and far more interesting structure for our guide. It is designed like a maze, through which visitors literally pass through a series of symbolic spaces associated with various esoteric traditions. There is a grotto that mimics an alchemical cave, a terrace with a mosaic resembling a rose compass surrounded by symbols derived from Masonic tradition, and underground tunnels that connect different parts of the park, going deep enough below ground to create a complete disconnection from the surface world. The total length of the underground tunnels is about 300 meters, and most of them are unlit, making navigation alone an experience that is difficult to describe as pleasant, regardless of one's attitude towards the paranormal. The central element of the park and the most well-known structure at Quinta de Regalera is the so-called initiation well, Pozo Iniciático, one of the most astonishing architectural features you will ever encounter, which, upon first sight, invokes that specific dizziness that occurs when expectations and reality diverge too sharply. From the outside, it appears to be an ordinary well structure, a low circular stone enclosure amidst ferns, of which there are several in the park. You lean over the edge and find that you are looking into a shaft about 3 meters in diameter and approximately 27 meters deep, the walls of which are adorned with 9 spiraling staircases that create a perfect descending spiral around the central void. At the center of the bottom lies a mosaic star of the Templars. The overall design replicates the symbolism of Dante's 9 circles in their descending motion. There has never been any water in this well. It was not built for water, but rather for initiation rituals, perhaps staged, perhaps fully genuine in their esoteric seriousness. Montero left no explanations. It is possible to descend into the well. It is open to tourists, and the staircase is equipped with railings. Most tourists go down, photograph the mosaic star at the bottom, then climb back up and continue on their way. Some, and there are enough testimonies to take them seriously, experience an increasing sense of discomfort during their descent, not related to height or claustrophobia, but rather akin to that feeling one gets when realizing they are in a space created with an intention they do not comprehend. This feeling is not paranormal. It is a very precise psychological reaction to an architectural space specifically designed to produce such an effect. Manini and Montero were knowledgeable enough in their fields to understand that architecture can influence a person's psychological state, with the same precision that music influences their emotions. The well embodies the quintessence of this principle. The underground tunnels connecting various parts of the park to the well and grottos form a separate world. They are made of rough stone, wide enough to walk through without bending, and dark enough that beyond the reach of a flashlight, you experience complete light isolation. The acoustics here are unusual. The sound of your own footsteps returns to you in a slightly altered form, creating that distinctive effect of a second presence, which we have already described in relation to Bhangarh Castle. The temperature in the tunnels is constant, about 5 to 7 degrees lower than outside, which, combined with the absolute silence and darkness, creates a sensation of complete immersion in another space, completely unrelated to the sunlit Portuguese park above. The history of paranormal phenomena at Quinta de Regalera somewhat differs from what we are used to in our guidebooks. There are no classic ghosts with established descriptions and repeating routes, no sealed rooms with mysteries, no documented deaths under suspicious circumstances. Instead, there is something more subtle, and perhaps more challenging to explain. The place is designed to affect you, regardless of your will and awareness. You might know nothing about Kabbalah, Rosicrucianism, or Masonic initiation rituals, yet you still find yourself in a space that Montero and Manini tuned like a musical instrument, precisely, methodically, and with a very specific purpose. The goal was to create a place capable of altering the state of consciousness of those passing through it. Judging by visitor testimonies, they succeeded. Tour guide Isabel Sousa, who has worked at Quinta de Regalera for over 15 years and penned a small unpublished book on the history of the palace, shared in an interview with the Portuguese magazine Visão in 2018 that throughout her years of work, she repeatedly observed the same phenomenon. Tourists descending into the initiation well as part of an organized group emerged changed, sometimes barely noticeably, sometimes quite significantly. Some become unusually quiet. Others, on the contrary, experience something akin to euphoria. Several individuals have cried upon emerging, without any apparent reason and no way to explain what exactly happened. This is not a scary place, Isabel Souza stated. It's a place that does something to you. What exactly depends on you. Montero knew this. He built precisely that. In 1910, Montero passed away in Lisbon, leaving the palace and park without heirs capable of or willing to maintain them in proper condition. For much of the 20th century, Quinta da Regalera gradually fell into decline, the tunnels became overgrown, and the park wild. In 1987, the palace was acquired by the Japanese company Yasuda, a fact that raises questions about the nature of their interest. And in 1997, it was handed over to the municipality of Sintra, which undertook restoration and opened the site to the public. Restoration, despite its thoroughness, has not uncovered the main mystery. What exactly happened in the tunnels and well during the life of Montero? His documents, mostly stored in private archives, do not provide a direct answer. His collection of books on esotericism was partially sold off and partially lost. The palace remains, the park remains, the tunnels and the well remain, and that feeling of a meticulously constructed intention remains, which cannot be extracted during any liquidation of assets because it is embedded not in objects, but in stone, space, and geometry. Quinta da Regalera is open daily. Tickets are sold online, and queues during the high season can be quite significant. The tunnels are partially illuminated, the well is equipped with railings and is considered safe. The administration recommends wearing comfortable shoes with non-slip soles. As for what happens to your state of consciousness while descending to the bottom of the shaft, which is 27 meters deep, where a star of the Templars is laid out on the mosaic floor, the administration does not warn you. However, Montero did not warn anyone either. This, it seems, was part of the plan. The next chapter will take us across the ocean to India, where in the jungles of the state of Rajasthan stands a fort that was abandoned overnight by all its inhabitants and has since been officially closed to visitors after sunset. Officially. What happens there at night, no official has dared to comment. The 10th story. Bhangarh Fort, a place where even birds do not fly. Rajasthan, India. Some warnings do not need explanations. A sign at the entrance to Bhangarh Fort, set by the Archaeological Department of India, a government organization known for its academic approach to everything related to the country's historical heritage, and which rarely allows itself to express opinions beyond dry administrative language, literally states, "Entry to Bhangarh Fort after sunset and before sunrise is strictly prohibited." No explanations. No references to safety procedures, preservation of historical sites, or property rights, just a prohibition, concise, unequivocal, and all the more convincing precisely because government agencies usually explain their bans. This one does not. Local residents are eager to provide explanations. Their versions differ in details, but align in the main aspect. After sunset, Bhangarh Fort becomes a different place. What exactly happens in this other place is described in various ways, but consistently, lights without a source, sounds without a cause, a feeling of presence without a visible being, and, in the most serious cases, a complete loss of spatial orientation in an area you knew perfectly well by daylight. The nearest village, Golaka, is located about 3 kilometers from the fort, and its inhabitants have long developed a simple rule which they follow with the naturalness that comes from rules tested by several generations. Do not go there at night. Not because they are afraid, but because there is no reason to. Fort Bhangarh was built in 1573 by Bhagwant Das, a military commander of the Great Mughal Empire and the Raja of Amber, as a fortified outpost in the Aravalli Mountains on the border between Rajasthan and what is now the state of Haryana. The location was chosen with impeccable military strategy. The fort sits atop a mountain slope, dominating the valley, offering natural protection on 3 sides, and has only one accessible approach on the 4th side, which is secured by several successive gates, each representing a distinct line of defense. Under the son of Bhagwant Das Man Singh, one of the most famous Rajput military leaders of the Akbat era, the fort was expanded and reached its zenith. It housed not merely a military garrison, but a full-fledged small town, with temples, markets, residential areas, gardens, and a water supply system ensuring autonomy in the event of a siege. At the height of its prosperity, Bhangarh had around 10,000 inhabitants, a considerable figure for a mountain fortress in the 17th century. The fort featured 5 major gates, several temple complexes dedicated to Shiva, Hanuman, and the goddess, and an advanced system of underground reservoirs that could withstand a prolonged siege without access to external water sources. The architecture of the fort belongs to that Rajput tradition capable of combining military functionality with genuine beauty. Intricately carved balconies, jaroka, jut out over the fortress walls. Delicate stone carvings adorn the gates and temple portals, while the overall layout adheres to a geometric precision that itself serves as an aesthetic statement. Then, in the middle of the 17th century, this vibrant and thriving town vanished, overnight. The circumstances surrounding the disappearance of the population of Bhangarh remain one of the most mysterious chapters in Rajput history, precisely because they defy standard historical explanations. There was no conquest. No hostile army has been recorded in the region during this period. There was no epidemic. None of the neighboring settlements suffered from disease at that time. There was no natural disaster. There are no geological or climatic records to suggest such an event. Simply put, 10,000 people left, all at once. Leaving behind homes, temples, markets, and much of their belongings, archaeological finds in the fort indicate that people left in a hurry without packing their belongings or closing doors. Where they went is also unknown. There are no historical records documenting the mass appearance of 10,000 refugees from Bhangarh in neighboring settlements. They did not appear in amber, did not settle in the valley villages, did not dissolve into nearby towns. In any case, there is no documentary evidence of this. They simply ceased to exist. Indian tradition attributes this event to a curse, and this explanation exists in several versions, each relying on sufficiently concrete details to avoid being merely a simple folktale. The most common version is associated with the figure of a hermit tantric named Sinkai, who lived in a cave on the slopes of a mountain overlooking the fort. According to this version, Princess Ratnavati, a young woman renowned for her beauty, the daughter of the then Raja Bhangraha, attracted the attention of the tantric, who, driven by passion, resorted to magical deception. He enchanted a hair oil that the princess had bought at the market, intending to use this spell to make her fall in love with him. The princess, or according to another version, one of her maidservants, recognized the conspiracy and poured the oil onto the ground. The oil turned into stone, which rolled down the mountain and crushed the tantric. As he was dying, he cursed the fort and all its inhabitants. They would die without the hope of rebirth and remain forever bound to this place. This is a legend. However, beneath the legend lies a historical fact. The fort was abandoned, and the reason for this abandonment remains unknown. And it is precisely in this space of uncertainty that what people see and hear here at night has filled over the course of several centuries. It is essential to posit one phenomenon that appears so consistently in the descriptions of Bhangraha that it deserves separate consideration. This phenomenon is the absence of birds. The fort is located in an area rich in flora and fauna. The surrounding forests are home to numerous species of birds typical of the dry forests of Rajasthan: peacocks, parrots, eagles, and several species of owls. Tourists visiting the fort during the daytime invariably notice one thing: the birds, which can be heard and seen everywhere in the surrounding forests, do not fly over the central part of the fort. They circle around it, perch on the outer walls and trees beyond the fortress boundaries, but do not cross the airspace above the inner courtyards. This observation has been documented by several independent ornithologists who visited the fort for research purposes, and it has yet to receive a convincing explanation. The infrasound hypothesis is less convincing here than in enclosed spaces. Birds tolerate infrasound well, and do not exhibit such behavior in other places with similar acoustic characteristics. The geomagnetic anomaly, detected by devices during several measurements in the center of the fort, explains the compass reading disruptions noted by some visitors, but does not sufficiently clarify the bird's behavior. As for the nocturnal phenomena, descriptions of which have accumulated over several centuries, In numbers sufficient for a separate monograph, they fall into several distinct categories. The first is visual, lights of various shapes and intensities moving within the fort during nighttime. These lights have been seen and continue to be seen by residents of nearby villages from several kilometers away, which rules out the theory of self-suggestion when directly present within the fort. The lights have been photographed multiple times, and the photographs, as is typical in similar cases, show something that can be interpreted differently depending on the observer's level of skepticism. The second category is auditory, voices, music, and the sounds of a market crowd heard at night by those at a distance from the fort. This phenomenon is particularly interesting from an acoustic perspective. The mountainous terrain around Bhangarh creates conditions for non-trivial sound propagation, and the sounds produced in the valley or on distant slopes can theoretically concentrate and reflect within the fort in unpredictable ways. The third category is sensory, the sensations experienced by the few who have found themselves inside the fort at night. This third category is the most underdocumented, simply because there are not many people who have spent the night in Bhangarh against the official ban and are willing to publicly discuss that experience. One of them is Indian journalist Rajiv Sharma, who wrote about it in his book on paranormal locations in Rajasthan, published in 2017. Sharma spent a night in the fort in 1998, before the ban was officially marked with a sign, as part of a small group. According to his description, the first few hours after sunset brought nothing unusual, except for the darkness and cold, which are quite predictable in a mountain fortress at night. Around midnight, several people in the group began to hear sounds that they interpreted as distant human voices, indistinct, like conversation behind several closed doors. The source of the sound could not be determined. With any movement, it seemed equally distant from all sides. Around 1 in the morning, 3 members of the group simultaneously, with no external stimuli, felt an acute urge to leave the fort immediately. So strong and physically palpable that they described it not as a thought, but as physical pressure. The group left. The next morning, returning in daylight, they found their belongings in the same place where they had left them, untouched and in the same order. Nothing was missing. Nothing had been moved. It was simply that something very insistent had asked them to leave. Another documented case pertains to 2003, when a small group of young people from Jaipur decided to spend the night in the fort, driven by the combination of skepticism and bravado that traditionally fuel such expeditions. One of the group members, Vikram Singh, an engineering student, wrote a detailed account of that night, which spread across Indian internet forums and was later cited in several studies. According to Singh, his group of 5 entered the fort at around 10 in the evening in full strength. However, after about 2 hours, they found that there were only 4 of them. The 5th member, Amit Verma, had disappeared. The search lasted about an hour. There are plenty of places in the fort where one can lose themselves in the dark, and ended with the discovery of Verma sitting in one of the inner courtyards in a completely unresponsive state. According to Singh, Verma did not respond to calls, stared off into space, and reacted with significant delay to attempts to physically attract his attention. He came to his senses approximately 20 minutes later and retained no memories of what had occurred in the interim. A medical examination conducted the next day found no pathologies. Rational explanations for the phenomena at Bhangarh exist, and, as usual, explain part, but not all. A geomagnetic anomaly at the center of the fort, confirmed by instrument measurements, may cause disorientation, dizziness, and anxiety in people with heightened sensitivity. Infrasound generated by the mountainous terrain under certain atmospheric conditions creates auditory effects and a sensation of pressure. The visual lights could be explained by marsh gases rising from old reservoirs of the fort, a phenomenon well known in regions with similar geology. The absence of birds remains inadequately explained. The simultaneous desire to leave among several individuals affected by infrasound is a predictable physiological reaction. Amit Verma's dissociative episode may be explained by a combination of stress, fatigue, darkness, and geomagnetic influence. All of this is true, yet the sign from the archaeological department stands. The government agency which explains everything, operating hours, codes of conduct, fines for violations, provides no explanation for this ban. Perhaps it is because the explanation it could provide does not fit within administrative language. Perhaps those who put up the sign knew something that both the residents of Golaki and the ornithologist observing the birds, as well as Rajiv Sharma, who felt pressure at 1 in the morning in the empty courtyard, also knew. Sometimes a ban with no explanation is the most eloquent explanation of all. Bhangarh Fort is open to visitors every day from dawn to dusk. Admission is charged, a sign stands at the gate, and the rules are clear. By day, it is one of the most beautiful examples of medieval architecture in Rajasthan. Majestic, photogenic, and quite safe. Everything that occurs after sunset remains outside our competence. And, apparently, outside the competence of the archaeological department as well. The next page of our journey brings us to our last Asian stop, taking us to China, where in Hunan province lies a village that locals bypass by several kilometers, and the central house has remained empty for several generations despite the acute housing shortage in the region. The reason for this emptiness is recorded in the local chronicles, and the account is unsettling, not because it sounds unbelievable, but because it sounds entirely ordinary. Story 11. The Jian Nan House, a place where history repeats itself more accurately than it should. Hunan Province, China. Chinese culture has a unique, deeply rooted attitude toward homes where violence or death has occurred. Homes that are referred to in Chinese as xiong literally meaning haunted dwelling. This concept is not superstition in the Western sense, but rather part of a very practical worldview. It is believed that the space where intense suffering has occurred retains its imprint, influencing subsequent inhabitants with the same inevitability that a poorly laid foundation affects the stability of a building. In modern China, real estate agencies are required by law to disclose to buyers information about deaths that have occurred in a property being sold, specifically because this reduces the market value of the home so significantly that concealing such information is classified as fraud. This is not a medieval superstition. It is a functioning norm of civil law. The house in question is a shunjai, to such an extent that it would place it beyond any market valuation, not because something once happened there, but because the same event occurs repeatedly with a methodical regularity that transforms randomness into a pattern, and a pattern into something for which we have no good word in any language. The village where this house stands is located in the rural part of Hunan Province, one of the central provinces of China, known for its humid climate, mountainous terrain, and a particular provincial insularity wherein local stories do not leave the confines of a few neighboring villages for decades. Let us call it, following the practice of Chinese journalists who have written about this place, Jiangnan Village, meaning south of the river, a toponym so commonly found in China that it serves as a reliable pseudonym for any specific location. The village's actual name appears in sources, but its residents have requested that it not be publicized, a request that I, as the author, intend to honor, since living people matter more than tourist interest. The central house of the village, the one we are discussing, was presumably built during the Qing dynasty, that is, between the 17th and early 20th centuries. It is a typical structure from rural Hunan of that era, a single-story building made of gray brick with a high curved roof, an inner courtyard surrounded by living quarters, and a deep well in the center of the courtyard. This type of architecture is called Si He Yuan, 4 sides of one courtyard, and is one of the most common forms of traditional Chinese housing, a closed space with a well at the center, providing the family with autonomy and security, with high external walls devoid of windows, only open to its interior. In this enclosure, there is a logic and a beauty, but there is also a particular trait, significant for our story. What happens inside such a house remains inside. Neighbors may hear, but not see. Passers-by may suspect, but not know. A Sihuyuan house is a small, closed universe, arranged so that its inner life belongs solely to those who live there. The history of the house in Jiangnan village begins, or, more precisely, is first recorded in local records, during the reign of Emperor Tongzhi, that is, in the 60s and 70s of the 19th century. At that time, the house belonged to a family with the surname Liu, prosperous farmers who owned several acres of land and a small workshop producing lacquered goods. The family consisted of several generations, a grandfather, his son with his wife, and 3 grandsons. In 1868, the grandfather, Liu Wensheng, nicknamed Old Liu, a respected man in the village known for his practicality, passed away in the house under circumstances that his son, Liu Guangmin, described in a letter to relatives in a neighboring village as death from fright. What exactly terrified the practical and esteemed Liu Wensheng to death in his own home, the letter does not explain. It only states that the old man woke up at night screaming, uttering something indistinct about coming out of the well, and then fell. This would have been an entirely ordinary event, an old man dying at night, likely from a heart attack accompanied by delirium, if a few years later the same story had not repeated itself. In 1874, Liu Guangmin, the very son who had written the letter about his father's death, died in the house in exactly the same manner, at night, screaming, managing to say something about the well. His wife, having outlived her husband, immediately sold the house and moved in with relatives. She lived a long life and refused to speak about the house with anyone for the rest of her days. The next few families that moved into the house over the following decades did so for no longer than a few years. The reasons for the departures were recorded differently in the village records. The family left the house of their own volition. The owner fell ill and moved in with children. The house was put up for sale due to a move to the city. Only one entry differs from the others in its straightforwardness. It is dated 1911 and made by the village elder in the local chronicle. The Chen family left the house by the well last night. Chen Ming said he could no longer sleep there. No one wanted to buy this house. It remains empty. The Soviet period of China's history, more precisely, the period of establishing the communist regime and the subsequent decades, brought a new dimension to the story of the house. In the 1950s, during the campaign for collectivization, the house was included in the collective farm fund and was used for grain storage, a decision made by local authorities precisely because the house had long been vacant and had no owners. The grain was stored poorly in the house. Several batches of grain put into storage spoiled faster than in neighboring facilities under identical conditions. The brigade leader of the collective farm, whose surname is recorded in local documents as Wan, wrote a report to the district center requesting a replacement storage facility, citing the unsatisfactory condition of the building. The district inspector came, inspected the house, and noted in his report that the building is in satisfactory condition. The reason for the grain spoilage remains undetermined. The grain continued to spoil. Eventually, the storage was moved to another location without giving an official explanation. In the 70s, during the Cultural Revolution, the house was briefly occupied by a youth brigade of Red Guards who used it as a meeting place. The brigade members lived in the house for about 3 weeks, after which they left and never returned. One of the former members of that brigade, Chen Lao, now an elderly man, gave an interview to Chinese journalist Wang Jian in 2019. He recounted that during the 3 weeks in the house, several members of the brigade stopped sleeping properly, 2 developed hallucinations, and one young man named Huang De was found in the morning sitting by the well in the same dissociative state previously described in relation to Amit Verma at Fort Bhangarh, unresponsive to calls, staring into the well water, and unable to remember how he got there. "We did not talk about it," Chen Liao said. "In those times, such things were not discussed. But we left, all at once, in one day, as if someone had given a command, though no one actually did." In the 80s and 90s, as China began to open up and urban legends found a new outlet through emerging media and later the internet, the story of the house by the well in Jiangnan village began to spread beyond just a few villages. Journalist Wang Jian, already mentioned, was the first professional reporter to write about this place for a broader audience. His article, published in 2019 in a popular online magazine, went viral in the Chinese segment of the internet and garnered a tremendous number of comments, many of which contained testimonies from individuals claiming to know the villagers personally or to be from the village themselves. Among the comments, several stood out from people identifying themselves as former residents of the village, all describing the same phenomenon, the well in the center of the courtyard. According to them, the water in the well was always colder than it should be for groundwater in that region, even in the summer. The surface of the water sometimes rippled in calm weather, and several individuals who stared into the well for long enough reported a feeling that the water reflected not what was above it, but something else entirely. A rational explanation for the phenomena in the house by the well includes several noteworthy elements. The well at the center of a four-sided courtyard is a source of continuous evaporation and gas exchange with underground aquifers. Depending on the local geology, groundwater may contain dissolved hydrogen sulfide, methane, or carbon dioxide that is released during evaporation in a confined courtyard space. It is precisely the enclosure of the courtyard, its high walls with no windows, virtually excluding cross-ventilation, that creates conditions under which the concentration of these gases at night, when evaporation is most active, can reach levels sufficient to affect the nervous system. Sleep disturbances, hallucinations, and dissociative states are documented effects of exposure to hydrogen sulfide at subthreshold concentrations. This explains why phenomena concentrate specifically at night, and particularly among people who have spent a long time in the house. It takes time for gas to accumulate in a closed space. The spoilage of grain during the Soviet period can be attributed to the same geological feature. Underground gases entering through the well create a chemical environment in a confined space that accelerates the biological decomposition of organic matter. The unusual chilliness of the water in the well may be due to the depth of the aquifer or the presence of an underground current. Ripples on the surface of the water during calm weather can result from seismic activity, which is not uncommon in the mountainous regions of Hunan. However, one thing these explanations do not cover is a story that repeats itself. Liu Wensheng died screaming that they came out of the well. Liu Guangmin died in exactly the same way 6 years later. Huang De was found by the well, staring into the water. The story of the house by the well in the village of Jiangnan is a tale of the same script played out by different actors in different eras, with a precision that exceeds the likelihood of random coincidence. Each episode can be explained individually through gases, psychology, and geology, and all these explanations will be correct. But it is impossible to explain why the script does not change. The house by the well stands empty. The village around it lives its life. No one plans to move in. No one plans to tear it down. It simply exists, with an unlocked door, a well in the yard, water that is colder than it should be, and sometimes ripples without wind. An ordinary building, an ordinary village, the most extraordinary emptiness at its very center. The penultimate stop on our journey takes us back to Europe, to Romania, but this time not to the touristy Transylvanian castles, but significantly deeper into the rural hinterlands, where in the Carpathian foothills stands a monastery whose history has so consistently eluded official sources that this very avoidance speaks more eloquently than any document. Story 12. The Corbii Monastery, a house chiseled in rock and deliberately forgotten. Carpathian foothills, Romania. There is a difference between places that are forgotten by accident and places that are forgotten intentionally. The former simply fall out of history. Documents are lost, eyewitnesses pass away, roads become overgrown. The latter disappear from collective memory deliberately, with a special effort that, in itself, is a testament to the fact that remembering this place is undesirable for reasons best left unspoken. The Corbii Monastery, the Monastery of Crows, belongs to the second category. It has not faded from history, it has been removed from it. Reaching Corbii is not easy, not because the road is dangerous, but because it scarcely exists. The nearest settlement is a small village approximately 7 kilometers to the west, connected to the monastery's location by a dirt road that becomes impassable during the rainy season and remains sufficiently battered during the dry season for an ordinary car to regret its decision. The last 2 kilometers of the road transition into a trail that follows a narrow mountain stream and ends at the foot of a rocky outcrop approximately 30 meters high, a nearly vertical limestone wall, which, upon closer inspection, reveals rectangular door and window openings. The Corbii Monastery is carved directly into the rock. It is not built, it is sculpted, crafted from the inside out, so the rock itself serves as the foundation, walls, and roof. Architecturally, this makes it one of the most unusual religious structures in Romania, and one of the most difficult to date. as rock architecture does not leave any construction joints that could help determine the age of the masonry. The official history of the monastery presumably begins in the 13th or 14th centuries. This is the widely accepted dating of rock monasteries in Wallachia, to which Corbii belongs. However, a number of researchers who have worked with local sources suggest that the cave chambers of Corbii are significantly older than their monastic use. The carving technique of the lower levels differs so much from the upper ones that it may indicate different historical periods of creation. The lower level, several low dark chambers carved into the very base of the rock, accessed by a narrow sloping corridor, shows tool marks and stone processing techniques characteristic of a period much earlier than the Middle Ages. Just how early is yet to be determined with sufficient certainty, as systematic archaeological research at Corbii has never been conducted. Not because it is impossible, but because no one has funded such research. And no one has funded it because no one has particularly raised this issue. And no one has raised it because the Corbii Monastery does not exist in most official registers of Romanian cultural heritage. This last circumstance is crucial. Romania has fairly detailed registers of historical sites. Rock monasteries in Wallachia are generally well studied and documented. Cornetu, Namaesti, and Ioaniti are mentioned in all relevant catalogues. Corbii is absent from most of them. Not because it is unknown. Locals are well aware of it, and several Romanian journalists have written about it since the 1990s. It is missing from the registers because submitting an application and undergoing an evaluation process to obtain official status is necessary for inclusion. No one has done this. And no researcher interested in Corbii has managed to obtain a clear answer to the question, why? The history of the monastery, as reconstructed from fragments of local legend and a few written sources, breaks down into several periods, each adding a new layer to the overall picture without negating the previous ones. The first period is the monastic one, dated approximately from the 14th to the 16th centuries. During this time, a small monastic community belonging to the Orthodox tradition of Wallachia lived in the rocky cells of Corbii. Very little is known about the monks of this period. Only a few names have survived in the memorial books of nearby monasteries, along with a couple of mentions in economic documents indicating that the monastery engaged in some agricultural activities in the surrounding villages. Nothing unusual. Nothing that would have distinguished Corbii among dozens of similar small rock communities. The unusual begins in the late 16th to early 17th century, when the Corbii monastic community suddenly ceased to exist. Not gradually, nor as a result of external circumstances, simply, at one moment, it stopped. The last mention of the monks of Corbii in accessible sources dates to the year 1604, found in correspondence from the Ungro-Wallachian metropolis. It discusses the request of the prior from a neighboring monastery to investigate what was happening in Corbii, since the brothers have been silent for 3 months, and none of those sent to inquire about them have returned with an answer. There is no record of a response to this request in the Metropolitan Archive. Either it was given verbally, or it was written and later removed, or there was nothing to respond with because there was nothing to learn. After this mention, Corbii disappears from written records for several centuries, practically completely. The only exception is a brief entry in the journal of an Austrian topographic officer who was mapping the Carpathian foothills during the Austrian occupation of Wallachia in the early 18th century. An officer named Rudolf von Hausmann mentions a rock structure by the river, known to locals by the name Corbii, into which no one enters out of superstitious fear. The description takes exactly one sentence. There is no following sentence. The officer moved on to describe the next topographical object. The superstitious fear mentioned by von Hausmann has specific content in local tradition, although this content varies from storyteller to storyteller, with the inconsistency characteristic of tales passed down orally over several centuries without written fixation. The general narrative is as follows. After the disappearance of the monastic community, several people from the surrounding villages entered the monastery and did not return. Then, some people entered and returned, but they came back changed, silent, avoiding company, dying within a few months without visible illness. After this, the villagers developed a simple rule that exists in one form or another to this day. One does not go to Corbii, especially not to the lower chambers. The lower chambers, those hewn in a technique distinct from the upper levels, located at the base of the rock and connected to the upper rooms by a narrow, sloping corridor, are the focal point of all legends associated with Corbii. According to the descriptions of the few who have descended into them and were willing to talk about it, the lower chambers differ from the upper ones not only in architecture, but also in atmosphere in the literal sense. The air there is different. It is colder and denser, with a characteristic smell that has been described in various ways. The smell of old stone, the smell of a deep well, a smell that has no name. In several lower-level chambers, fragments of paintings or carved images have survived, the nature of which none of the researchers who described them could attribute with certainty. They do not correspond to either Orthodox iconography or known pre-Orthodox traditions of the region. Some Romanian historians who saw their photographs have suggested the influence of the Bogomil tradition, a medieval dualist heresy widely spread in the Balkans, whose followers were persecuted by the Orthodox Church with the same determination that the Catholic Church pursued the Cathars in the West. The Bogomils had their own ritual traditions, part of which involved the use of isolated, underground, or rocky spaces. This explanation is not universally accepted, and proving it in relation to Corbii is difficult, but it would account for both the lower chambers and their possible age, as well as the reasons why the Orthodox metropolis preferred not to provide a written response regarding the fate of the monastic community in 604. Journalist and paranormal researcher Andrei Popescu visited Corbii in 2006 and published a detailed report on his website, which was subsequently republished several times by Romanian publications. Popescu reached the monastery accompanied by a local resident, an elderly peasant named Dumitru, who agreed to show the way on the condition that he would not enter the monastery himself. Dumitru stopped at the foot of the cliff and waited outside. Popescu spent about 2 hours in the upper rooms, photographing and taking notes. According to his description, the upper cells were small rectangular rooms with even walls, niches for icons, and remnants of wooden flooring. There was nothing unusual from a psychological point of view, just old empty rooms with good stone masonry. A narrow corridor with a sloping floor led to the lower chambers, descending at an angle of about 30 degrees. Popescu descended about halfway down the corridor. He did not go further. In his report, he describes the reason for retreating without attempting to rationalize it. Midway down, I stopped. Not because I was afraid of the darkness or the narrowness. I had worked in similar places and was accustomed to both. I stopped because I felt very clearly, distinctly, and without a hint of ambiguity, that I should not go further. It was not fear in the usual sense. It was knowledge. Just as you know that a hot stove is hot without touching it. I did not touch it. I turned back. At the end of the report, he adds one observation that defies any rational explanation, and which he does not comment on himself. When he left the monastery and reunited with Dumitru, the clock on his phone showed a time that was 47 minutes later than it should have been. The phone's battery, fully charged upon entry, had drained to zero. Peter Ionescu, a Romanian geologist who visited Corbii in 2014 with instruments to measure the gas composition of the air, obtained results in the lower corridor that he characterized as technically explainable but practically extraordinary. The concentration of carbon dioxide in the lower part of the corridor was 4.5 times higher than normal and continued to rise as one descended. According to Ionescu, at such concentrations, a person experiences rapid heartbeat, dizziness, mounting anxiety, and, with prolonged exposure, loss of consciousness. This explains why people who descended into the lower chambers returned altered, or did not return at all. It explains the feeling of knowing that Popescu experienced midway down. His brain, receiving the first doses of carbon dioxide-rich air, reacted with alarm before consciousness could interpret what was happening. It explains the drained phone. Electronic devices behave unpredictably in environments with high levels of carbon dioxide and moisture. The 47 lost minutes, however, remain unexplainable. The Corbii Monastery does not have official status, is unguarded, not restored, and is not included in any tourist route. Local authorities are aware of its existence and regard it with the same calm indifference they show towards most things that are easier to ignore than to explain. Dumitru, who accompanied Popescu to the rock, died in 2011. His son, reportedly, knows the way to the monastery but does not show it, not out of malice. Simply, he says, there's no reason to take people there. This, as you may have gathered from our journey, is the most common and convincing argument we have heard about any of the places we visited. No reason. Just no reason. We have one last stop remaining. The final chapter of our guide brings us back to where we started, in the United States of America, but this time not to sunny California or spicy Louisiana, but to the very heart of the American Midwest, where in the state of Ohio stands a house about which locals say just one thing: it does not want to remain empty. No matter how many times it is freed, it finds new tenants. The problem is that the tenants then regret it. 13th and last story. The house on Franklin Castle, a place that chooses its victims. Cleveland, Ohio, United States of America. We have returned to where we began, back to America, to an old house with a history, to an architecture that hides something behind its facade. But while the Winchester Mansion was a house of fear, built by a woman fleeing from her own ghosts, the house on Franklin Castle is something fundamentally different. This is a house that does not run away. It stands firm. It waits. And which, judging by all the documentation accumulated about it, possesses a quality that, in living beings, we call persistence, while in buildings, we don't quite know what to call it, which is why we label it a curse. Franklin Castle stands at the corner of Franklin and Rosemary Streets in the western part of Cleveland since 1881, a gray-brown four-story sandstone building with turrets, pointed windows, and gargoyles on the cornices, exemplifying the eclectic style that American architects of the late 19th century referred to as Rhenish Romanticism, which in Cleveland at that time symbolized wealth and cultural aspirations. The house was built for German immigrant Hans Tiedemann, a banker and merchant who made a fortune in sugar trade and succeeded enough to indulge in an architectural whim, a building that looks like a small German castle transported to the streets of an American industrial city. Architect Leonard Bieber handled the task brilliantly. The result is a structure that, even today, surrounded by far more modest buildings in the neighboring blocks, gives the impression of something out of place. Not in the sense of being ugly, but in the sense of belonging to another place and another time, accidentally landed here and showing no intention of leaving. Hans Tiedemann moved into the new house with his wife Louise and several children in the year the construction was completed. The family was large and by all outward signs happy, at least until the house began to diminish in its inhabitants with a methodical regularity that is hard not to notice as something intentional. In 1881, shortly after moving in, little Tiedemann's daughter, Emma, who was not yet 2 years old, died. In 1882, another daughter passed away. In 1883, yet another. In 1885, Louise's mother, who lived in the house, died. In 1891, Louise herself passed away. Each of these deaths was officially explained. The children died of diseases quite common for that era, Louise's mother from old age, and Louise from heart disease. In the 19th century, child mortality was a tragic norm, not an exception. And yet, 5 deaths in one house over a decade, even by the standards of the 19th century, is a number that makes neighbors start to whisper quietly to one another. Hans Tiedemann outlived his wife by several years, remarried to a woman significantly younger than himself named Genevieve, and in 1895 sold the house, moving to more modest accommodations. What exactly prompted him to sell the building into which he had poured so much effort and resources, official sources do not explain. Genevieve Tiedemann, in her correspondence partially preserved in the Cleveland Public Library, mentioned the house several times, and not once in a kind light. The most telling phrase from her letter to a friend, dated 1994, translates approximately to, "This house does not like women. I know this as surely as I know my own name, and I intend to leave it before it proves me right." After the Tiedemann family, the house changed owners several times, none of whom stayed longer than a few years. At the beginning of the 20th century, the building was used as a multifamily apartment house. In the 20s, it served as a political club for the German community of Cleveland, and, in the 30s, it became the headquarters of one of the organizations connected to the emerging nationalist movement, adding yet another unpleasant layer to the building's history. In the 40s and 50s, the house returned to residential use, again changed hands multiple times, and once more remained vacant. The most thoroughly documented episode in the history of Franklin Castle involves the Romano family, who purchased the house in 1968. Roman Romano, a Cleveland entrepreneur, bought the building for a relatively low price. It is worth noting that Franklin Castle has always been sold cheaply for its class, which is a telling market signal in itself, and moved in with his wife Josephine and their 6 children. The Romano family lived in the house for 6 years, longer than most of its predecessors, and during those 6 years they accumulated such an extensive record of inexplicable events that Josephine Romano later wrote a book about them, published in a limited run in 1992, which became a primary source for all subsequent researchers of the house. According to Josephine, the first signs of trouble appeared just a few weeks after moving in. The children began to complain that someone walked through the rooms at night, that voices could be heard beyond the walls, and that in one of the third-floor bedrooms, the one the family eventually stopped using, there was sometimes a feeling of a physical presence strong enough that none of the children would agree to sleep there. Josephine herself described several episodes that were unexplainable within the context of an old creaking building. Twice, she saw the figure of a woman in the dark corridor on the 4th floor, clear, motionless, vanishing when Josephine stepped forward. Once, she heard a distinct sound of a child crying from a walled-off part of the 2nd floor, long enough and clear enough that she walked through all the rooms searching for one of her children, before realizing that all 6 were asleep in their beds. The walled-off areas of the house are a separate story deserving special attention. During their time living in the house, the Romanos discovered several sealed-off spaces that were not noted in any documents, nor had the seller mentioned their existence. The first was a small room behind a wooden panel on the 3rd floor, discovered by chance when one of the children noticed that the panel sounded different when struck than the others. The room was empty, but its walls bore the marks of use. Several hooks hammered in at a height inconvenient for an adult, and characteristic scuffs on the floor forming a semicircle against the opposite wall. The second sealed space was a narrow passage between the outer wall and an inner partition on the 4th floor, discovered during some minor renovation work. In this passage, according to Josephine, workers found several items, the nature of which she vaguely describes in her book, things that were better left unseen, and which we immediately removed from the house. She doesn't specify what those items were. This is the only place in her book where the author intentionally avoids details, and for that reason, it is the most eloquent. In 1974, the Romanos sold the house, not, as Josephine states, due to paranormal phenomena, but simply because we grew tired of the feeling that the house didn't want us. This wording is precise and quite rare. Most people leaving difficult places explain their decision with anything but that. The Romanos named things as they were, which lends their testimony particular weight. After the Romanos, the house entered a period of frequent ownership changes. No one stayed longer than 2 or 3 years, and gained a reputation in Cleveland as a place where parapsychologists, journalists, and thrill-seekers visited with enviable regularity. In 1984, a group led by Cleveland paranormal researcher John Pellegrino conducted several night sessions in the house with a full set of the research equipment of the time. Pellegrino later described these sessions in interviews as the most intense experience of my entire professional career, a telling phrase for someone who specialized in paranormal research. The specific results? Audio recording equipment captured sounds interpreted as voices on the 3rd floor over 2 nights, indistinct but rhythmic, like conversation. A thermal camera showed a consistent cold spot in one of the bedrooms near the northern wall, which could not be explained by air movement or the insulating properties of the materials. One group member experienced a sharp and sudden onset of anxiety in the sealed room on the 3rd floor that forced him to leave, which did not recur once he exited. 2 other group members independently described, hours later, without discussing their experiences, a feeling that someone was watching them from the end of the corridor on the fourth floor. In 1998, the house was acquired by an organization called the Cleveland Society of Polish Singers, intending to use it as a rehearsal space and cultural center. Rehearsals took place in the house for about 2 years, after which the organization quietly moved to another location, without commenting on the reasons for the change of address. Several former members of the society, who were later interviewed by journalists, provided their testimonies on the condition of anonymity. They all described a similar feeling of discomfort during long rehearsals in the evening hours. A few individuals claimed to have seen something on the staircase leading to the third floor, and at least one musician refused to return to the building after staying late one evening and hearing sounds behind a closed door in one of the rooms, which he described as singing, just not ours and not now. In 2003, the house was purchased by a private buyer with the intent of conducting a complete renovation and converting it into a private residence. The renovation began, and it was during these restoration works that a discovery was made that shifted the focus of the Franklin Castle's history and simultaneously raised new questions that remain unanswered. Upon opening the walls in several rooms, the workers discovered human remains, multiple ones. The exact number is noted in police records from that time, but in public sources, it varies from 11 to several dozen. The police conducted an investigation that established that the remains belonged to individuals who died no less than 100 years ago, which took any potential crime, if it had occurred, beyond the statute of limitations and out of reach of contemporary criminal investigations. Forensic analysis was unable to determine either the cause of death or the identities of the deceased. The case was closed due to the inability to identify any culpable parties. Who did these remains belong to? When did they end up within the walls of the house? Under what circumstances did these people die? There are no answers to these questions. Neither the Cleveland Police Archives, historical documents, nor the Tiedemann family records offer any clues to the mystery. The house keeps its dead with the same impenetrable solidity as Glamis Castle keeps its secret room, silently, firmly, and, seemingly, forever. After this discovery, the renovation slowed down and ultimately was never completed. The buyer sold the house again, cheaply, quickly, with no comments. The house remains standing at the corner of Franklin and Rosemary, with that stone patience which is its most constant characteristic. It has outlasted the Tiedemanns, the Romanos, and the Polish singers. It will outlast the next occupants as well. The rational explanation for the phenomena of Franklin Castle is, perhaps the simplest among all we have encountered in this guide, yet it is also the most difficult to accept. Old houses with human remains in their walls exert a powerful psychological effect on people, regardless of whether they are aware of the remains. Sealed rooms create acoustic and temperature anomalies that can be explained from a physics perspective. Hydrogen sulfide from decaying organic matter in sealed spaces creates neurological effects identical to those we have described in relation to other locations. The psychological impact of a long-standing reputation of a house on its residents creates a self-fulfilling prophetic cycle. People expect the strange, they find the strange, they talk about the strange, and the next residents anticipate even stranger occurrences. All of this is true, and yet, 11 people within the walls. At least 11 individuals who died under mysterious circumstances and were entombed within the walls of a home that appears, from the outside, to be a model civic mansion of a respected banker. 11 people whose absence went unnoticed, or perhaps noticed but unacknowledged. 11 silences that have become part of the brickwork. This really sums up our journey. 13 houses, 13 stories, 13 ways in which architecture, history, and human suffering intertwine into something for which we have neither a precise word nor a comprehensive explanation. We have visited the labyrinth of a Californian widow, a misty Yorkshire manor, a Transylvanian castle appropriated by the tourism industry, a non-existent Japanese village, a Louisiana plantation, a Scottish castle with a hidden secret, a Roman island of death, the ruins of Corellia, a Portuguese cipher made of stone, an Indian fort without birds, a Chinese house with a repetitive script, a Romanian cliff with vanished monks, and a Cleveland mansion with silent walls. What unites them? Not ghosts. Ghosts are a metaphor, not an explanation. Not curses. Curses are a narrative, not a cause. What connects them is this. Each of these places is a point where human suffering, real, documented, measurable, has reached such a concentration and duration that the space around it has changed. Just as the air changes around a fire, just as the land changes around the place where water has stood for a long time. We name this differently. Cursed place, unpleasant apartment, Sunchzai, Hiisi, a place with memory, depending on language and tradition. But essentially, we are referring to the same thing, a place that remembers. Infrasound explains anxiety, mold explains hallucinations, gases explain dizziness, psychology explains self-suggestion, geology explains temperature anomalies, acoustics explain voices. All of this is true, and yet together they do not explain the simple fact that some places do not want us. They communicate this through every means available to them: scent, sound, temperature, pressure, and an inexplicable urge to leave immediately. And we, generally, receive this message but do not always heed it. Follow this advice. It is the only practical guidance this guide can offer you. When a place does not want you, leave. Not because ghosts inhabit it, but because something else resides there that lacks a name, and this something is significantly older than us, considerably more patient, and much better adapted to waiting in dark rooms for a long time than we are to staying there. Dear reader, you have reached the end. This means one of two things. Either you have read this guide in good light and in good company, and if so, bravo, you are a wise person. Either you read it at night, alone, in an old house with creaky floors. And then let me ask, what is that sound in the hallway? The one you heard a few minutes ago and thought you imagined it? Good night. And stay in your room. End of the route. All 13 mansions have been visited. The author hopes the reader is alive.